And now we go over to David Dimbleby and Peter Snow for the results of the Euro elections '89 at home and abroad.
Most of Europe has voted against the government in power tonight. Britain is no exception. First results suggest a night of lost seats for Mrs Thatcher. Tonight, the Tories will be hoping the damage is limited, that their heartland seats, at least, are safe. Labour is waiting to see whether it's made headway not just in its own traditional areas, but nationwide. The smaller parties, the Nationalists and the Greens, wait to see if they've dented the larger parties, and the Democrats are fearful that they've been pushed into fourth place. From all these counts, we'll be reporting tonight. And the votes are also being counted throughout Europe. It's an electorate of over 240 million people. It'll give us the makeup of the new European Parliament. It'll tell us the signal that's being sent to governments and to the supporters of parties of right and left. Is there more to a Euro poll than a chance to chastise those in power? And with us here in London tonight, Cecil Parkinson, the Tory Energy Secretary, now variously tipped as the next Chancellor of the Exchequer, or party chairman once more. Gerald Kaufman, Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary, who played a key part in the modifications made to Labour's nuclear defence policy, which some say will help Labour back into government. David Steele, former leader of the Liberal Party, architect of the new Democrat Party, which seems to have had a disastrous night. He's also standing as a Liberal for a constituency in Italy, the first politician to cross European boundaries in that way. And Sarah Parkin of the Green Party, which seems to have done well here in Britain and well in much of Europe as well. Also with us, John Cole, the BBC's political editor, and Stephen Milligan, the BBC's Europe correspondent. We'll also hear reaction to the results from other European capitals. In Brussels tonight, Jeremy Paxman.
Well, the European Parliament building here is really alive with over 1,000 journalists watching the results coming in from across the community on 30 different television monitors. Over the next 3.5 hours, we'll be bringing you a full picture of how the new European Parliament will look and analysing what that new Parliament means both for Britain and the rest of the community with a number of distinguished European statesmen.
First indications from Paris, a small lead for the former French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and his opposition list over the Socialists, and a breakthrough for the Greens. We'll bring you the results from the Ministry of the Interior in Paris.
Here in Bonn, the governing Conservatives, the CDU-CSU, are in deep trouble. But the real gainers tonight are the Republikaner, the extreme right-wing Republicans who've stormed into Strasbourg and the European Parliament.
And to tell us who's up and who's down here in Britain, Peter Snow.
Well, I'll be constructing a picture of how the new European Parliament in Strasbourg differs from the old, in which on the whole the centre-right had the majority. And I'll also be looking at the way, with all eyes here in Britain on the two-party fight for the European seats, we'll have a UK battleground in which we'll be deciding which way the parties are moving. And I'll be discussing all this with Professor Anthony King of Essex University.
Our exit poll, which was done by NOP last Thursday night when voting finished here in the United Kingdom, showed a startling decline in the Conservative vote to the advantage of Labour and of the Green Party. That NOP poll put Labour at 44%, the Conservatives 12 points behind at 32%, the Greens third with 14%, and the Democrats nowhere with only 6%. And our prediction was that Labour, on the basis of that NOP poll, would have 51 seats in the new European Parliament and the Conservatives 26. Well, we've had a handful of results in. We've only so far had one Labour gain in the south of Scotland, and we're waiting for more to come through. But Mr Parkinson, first of all, the result of that poll seems to have been to set the cat among the pigeons in the Tory party. There's obviously a state of alarm, if I could put it at its least, among European candidates for the Tories.
Well, I think if you have a poll on a Thursday and you have the declaration of the result 3 days later, you'll have a lot of nervous candidates on your hands, and there's no doubt that one or two of them have been nervous and have been shooting off. But I don't set any great store by that.
But you've now had a chance, presumably in private, to examine what did actually happen. Do you believe it's going to be a bad night for the Conservatives?
I don't know. It seems to me from the results that have come out so far that your exit poll may have overstated the case, as it has in the past. I'm looking forward to the evening developing, and as we see what the actual results are, then I'll feel better qualified to comment.
And if it's gone badly, you'll accept that it's gone badly and comment frankly about the state of play in the Tory party?
Yes, of course I will, and I'll remind people that between 83 and 84, there was a 5% swing to Labour, the difference between the 83 election and the 84 Euro election.
We have to go to our first result live. We go to Glasgow and join John Nicholson.
But Hugh McMahon, the Labour candidate, won it with a big majority in 1984. He's expecting certainly to hold on to the seats after hearing the results of the first vote in Strathclyde.
Douglas Herbison, Social and Liberal Democrat, 8,098. Hugh Robertson McMahon, Labour, 89,000. $89,627. Stephen James Robin, Scottish Conservative, 45,872. And I therefore declare elected, with a majority of 39,591, to serve as a representative in the European Assembly, Hugh Robertson McMahon.
Well, Mr. Returning Officer, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends, first of all, could I thank the Returning Officer and his staff for the efficient and effective way they've executed the count. Could I also thank particularly those people who worked extremely hard to get me here. A candidate is only really the standard bearer in a contest. He depends on the very hard work by the backroom team to put him there. And I would like to thank my agent, my sub-agents or conveners as they were called, my office staff who carried out all sorts of tasks above and beyond the call of duty.
Well, this is the winning candidate, Hugh McMahon, who's celebrating his victory. The big change, of course, in this seat is that last time the Conservatives came second. However, this time the Scottish National Party have pulled up to second place to match their result in the other Strathclyde seat, where they also came second. Conservative vote has dropped substantially, and that's bound to be a big worry for the Conservative Party, coming as it does after the other two Scottish seats we've seen so far.
And I think to say this about my opponents, at least we did in Strathclyde West raise the issues a little bit more in that
this is a very diverse constituency, Strathclyde West. It's one which includes Hunterston, the South of Scotland nuclear station.
It was a very bad night for Margaret Thatcher.
They're said to have welcomed Labour's change in policy and the policy review, but it certainly hasn't necessarily been reflected in the votes. Back to you in the studio, David.
Good, so that's our first live result from Glasgow Strathclyde West, a safe hold for Labour. I'm afraid we clipped the Scottish Nationalist result, so I can't give it to you at the moment. But anyway, we think we have another one coming in just a moment from Cleveland and Yorkshire North. This is a very marginal one, perhaps the most marginal of the Euro constituencies, which the Conservatives hold at the moment. But while we're just waiting for that, Gerald Kaufman, Mr. Parkinson's had a chance to say what he thinks the Tories are looking for. The Labour Party has been notably cautious about being over-enthusiastic. Do you have information that we're not privy to about how Labour has actually done in the last 2 days?
Not yet, no. We've been optimistic for the last several weeks of the campaign. Before that, we realised that we had quite a job to hold our seats on the basis of the 1987 election result. On that, we would have lost some seats this time. We've been hoping to win between 5 and 10. If we win more than that, then I will be very pleased indeed. What we need to do is to be judged on what progress we've made rather than comparison with an exit poll. So let's wait and see what happens.
Well, we'll be comparing the results when they come in, of course, with the 87 election result. David Steele, our exit poll was not encouraging for the Democrats, 6%. If it were 6%, and I put in the caveat that it might not be, if you'd come third to the Greens, fourth after the Greens, would that suggest that the Democrats really had too far to go now to make up ground by the next election?
No, I don't think so, because you can't wash away what happened only a month ago in the elections, the county elections in England and Wales, where we were getting nearly 20%. And I think what matters in these elections, or what it shows, is that where we had people elected, where there are 450 councillors already in place, then we can hold our position quite comfortably. The Euro elections have always been the most difficult for us. We haven't got any seats. Everybody knows we haven't got any seats. We know that the election system distortions are greater in the big seats, and therefore people knew we hadn't a chance. And also, I say with great respect to the Greens, that throughout Europe, the Euro election, above all, is the place where people might well be tempted to vote Green, because Green issues are European issues.
We go now to Cleveland and Yorkshire North and join Sarah Spiller for the result from there.
Held on the 15th day of June 1989, hereby give notice that the number of votes recorded for each candidate at the said election is as follows. Andrew Ralph Irving,
SDP,
7,970. Bo David Robert,
Labour,
94,900.
So Labour have taken this seat with a huge majority.
94,953. Dumbleton Owen,
Green,
17,225.
Green candidate doing very well there.
Thomas William,
Democrat.
8,470. Van Eck Peter Beckford Rutgers,
Conservative.
70,861. And I do hereby declare that the said David Robert Bow is duly elected as member of the European Parliament for the said.
So Labour have overturned the Conservative majority of 2,625, a massive majority here. Sir Peter Van Eck, resident MEP since 1979, a very, very good result for Labour. A huge constituency to canvass, ranging from Hartlepool on the east coast over to the Pennines. Labour delight here tonight.
Can you hear me?
So a Labour victory there. Again, we can't work out the exact proportion of swing and change at the moment that we'll be able to do. Perhaps Mr Kaufman could do it, being a wizard mathematician. But anyway, that's the second Labour game we've had. South of Scotland first, and now this one from Cleveland and Yorkshire North. Let's just, though, while we wait for some more results in, go to the Green Party. Your position, according to our poll at any rate, is that you're in third place with 14%. Now, my understanding is that this has been a very strong Green vote in the south of England, not much in Scotland, not much in Wales, and not as good in London as in the rest of the south. Is that as you see it?
Well, that's what your regional poll breakdown of the poll does show. I've been speaking around the countryside, and generally our canvassing returns have been showing between 8 and 10% overall. I think I'd like to wait and see exactly what the firm results are before commenting on the regional divisions. Because in the county elections in May, we actually experienced a great rise in our vote all over the country, north and south, wherever we stood. So, you know, I'm not so certain that there might be that much of a regional division this time.
What do you make of what David Steele said, that this is actually a vote which is sort of in a balloon? It doesn't actually mean anything, and therefore people are prepared to vote Green.
Well, I think it's far from being in a balloon, because in this country the vote for the Greens has been going up steadily over 7 years. I just think it's that other politicians and commentators haven't noticed it. And also the Green vote all over Europe, indeed all over the world, has been going up. You know, the first Green entered a national parliament in 1979, and there are now Greens sitting in 13 national parliaments. There was somebody elected to the Irish Parliament just recently. So this is definitely a trend that's been going on for some time.
Do you have an idea where you're taking that vote from?
Well, certainly travelling around the country, the vote seems to be coming from everywhere. I think it's coming from the Conservatives because people are very dissatisfied with how Mrs Thatcher has been dealing with environmental issues. I think it's also coming from the Labour Party, people who are disappointed in the policy review. And I think it's coming also from the Democrats because, well, I mean, they have unfortunately suffering from their political adventuring and also a programme that takes a little bit from everywhere but is not really coherent.
John Cole, from your point of view, what do you think the parties should be looking out for, and what is the worry for the Tories in this, if it is as bad as our exit poll suggested on Thursday?
Well, there are two separate schools of Tories. There are those who say quite calmly that this is mid-term, that it happened to them last time and the time before, and that they only have to keep their nerve and it will all come right. They've got 2 years or arguably 3 years if things get difficult, where they can change it round. But as you mentioned earlier, that has not been the mood among the MEPs, the Conservative MEPs who stood to lose their seats, nor indeed when one talks privately to a lot of Conservatives on the telephone today is it their mood. They say that there will be a big effort to calm things down over the next couple of days, but that after that some of them will be looking for an inquest into the campaign, which they think was badly conducted, and also some changes in July in the government to give it a fresh face, particularly in areas like the environment and perhaps in the party chairmanship.
Well, let's now see if we can have a look at some of the results that have come in. Labour gained Midlands Central there, but let's see some of the results we've actually had in and have a look at the way that the vote has divided between the parties and in particular how it's changed. This is the United Kingdom as a whole with 21 results in. We now have the Labour a net gain of 2, Conservatives a net loss of 2, 15 and 16 respectively, no change in the others. And let's just see some of the seats. South of Scotland, a Labour gain. Now, just to explain this, that's the raw result, of course, in Scotland. Labour 81,000, the Conservatives 65,000, SNP 35,000. Conservatives would have done well to hold this seat. The majority, the Democrats are 10,300. The majority that the Labour Party's got is 15,693 on a fairly high turnout, 42%. Something like 33% is normal. Now have a look at the way people voted on Thursday, remember, in south of Scotland. This is the actual share of the vote. And what we do now is to compare it, because each of these Euro constituencies is made up of 7 to 9 Westminster constituencies. So we add up the vote at the general election in 1987 in all those constituencies and compare it with the share that was got on Thursday. And this is the change in the south of Scotland. Labour just up 3%, the Conservatives up by 1% on the election, the sufferers are the Democrats down 15%, the SNP only up 5%. Now let's see some of the others. Lothians, Labour hold on to, and there is the vote. A majority in Lothians for Labour of 38,000, one that they should certainly win, includes all the Edinburgh seats here. And this is the change from the 1987 general election. The SNP up 10%, the Greens up 10%, the Democrats way down at 17% down. Conservatives just slipping 4%. And White and Hampshire East, that's the Isle of Wight, a Conservative hold here. It was one that everybody thought they would hold, 90,000, and their majority is 39,000, only slightly down on the majority at the 1984 Euro elections, a smallish turnout. Look at the change again on the general election in 1987. Down 11%, up 14 for Labour, up 20 for the Greens, and down 23 for the Democrats. Now, in the south of England, that may well be the story we're watching tonight. The Greens taking votes effectively from the Democrats, up 20 for them, down 23 for the Democrats. Greater Manchester East, this is a Labour hold. This was thought to be a vulnerable one if things had gone well for Labour, for the Conservatives tonight, but it's a Labour hold with a majority of 34,000, which is well up on their majority in the last European election. Again, a fairly high turnout, 37% there. And this is the change on the 87 result. Labour up 13%, the Conservatives down 8%. Greens do well, Democrats once again doing very poorly, down 15%. And now Midlands West, Labour hold this seat. Their majority was slashed there in the 87 Euro election. It was one of the seats Gerald Corfin was talking about a moment ago where they could have been in difficulty. In fact, they've got a majority of 42,000 against a majority of 20,000 in 84. And compared with the general election in 87, they've recovered their position, up 14%, Conservatives down 11, the Green up 11, Democrats still doing poorly there, down 14%. So that's how we'll be looking at the results, and particularly noting these comparisons between the various parts of the country, how the Democrats, how the Greens have done, how Labour and the Tories have done. Labour gained Cheshire West. We'll have that result in just a moment. It's been Conservative since '79. It was 8th, I think, for the target of Labour, so they've taken that number 8 target of theirs. Peter.
Right, well, now let's set this British parliamentary battle in the European elections in context. First of all, here's what happened in the European elections just 5 years ago. Mrs Thatcher's Conservative Party had 45 of these big super seats. Neil Kinnock had 32, 13 behind Mrs Thatcher. The Alliance had none, and the others had 4. Now, here they are. There's that huge one, the SNP, Winnie Ewing of the SNP one in Scotland. Just look at the size of it, from the Shetlands right down here to the Mull of Kintyre. That's the Highlands and Islands, and that's the Scottish National Party. There are the 3 seats in Northern Ireland, voted in by proportional representation, waiting for tomorrow. And here are these huge, 78 huge European parliamentary seats in Britain. That is just one seat, the northeast of Scotland. South of Scotland, that's another one. This is what they were like in '84. Notice that the Tories just had 2 seats in Scotland. Down in the south of England here, south of Birmingham, Labour only had 5 seats in London, and 3 of those would have gone to the Tories in the last general election. Now, here are the seats. This is our UK battleground. These are the 81 seats in the United Kingdom, stretched right across the political spectrum, starting with the safest seat here, Yorkshire South, for Labour, something like 67,000 votes, the majority there. That's roughly the electorate of an ordinary parliamentary seat. And as you come down the list, so these Labour seats get less and less safe for Labour until they get very vulnerable down about here, and then the Tory vulnerable seats start up. That's how we've listed them, so that you go from safe Labour down to unsafe Labour, unsafe Tory, and as you come up here, so they get more and more comfortable for the Conservatives. And this is their colour in the old European Parliament. There's Winnie Ewing's seat there. There are the 3 seats in Northern Ireland. Now, this then is the action area here. And if the Labour Party can turn these seats, roughly all of these seats here, red, actually only 7 of them red, and keep all their own, then they will effectively have won this election by getting the majority of these seats in the European Parliament. Now, we do have some results in. Here they go. There are the ones that have been declared so far. And notice what's happened. You do have the Labour red extending down into this vulnerable Tory area here, and Labour even gaining Midland Central up here. And there are some gains. There are the gains flashing. The little white bubble there flashing means that it's a gain for Labour. The red ones are Labour. And now let's see how, at the end of the night, we at the moment forecast. It's very early yet, but we're fairly confident that we can roughly forecast that those seats will colour up like this by the end of the night. And there you see the Conservatives forecast to hold a few seats in London there. Labour pushing down here in the north, Cheshire East, Shropshire and Stafford, Nottingham. It's early yet, but that's sort of, there we are, that's a forecast gain there. You see these ones here are gains forecast. But roughly speaking, it does look as though Labour will just win the majority of these European parliamentary seats. It is a bit early yet to say for certain, though. So we're forecasting that in the end, by the end of the night, Neil Kinnock will have 44 seats for Labour. Mrs Thatcher will have just 33, 11 behind Labour, reversing the position almost precisely, although Mrs Thatcher had 13 more than Labour last time, that there will be no Democrats for Paddy Ashdown. The others will have 4. Here we are, there's the forecast. There you see North East Scotland, the only seat in Scotland that the Conservatives are forecast to hold at the moment. Actually, South of Scotland is gone, so that's the only seat they could possibly hold in Scotland. And you notice Labour stretching right down here through the whole of Wales and getting a few more seats here in London. And finally, a look at what we think the projected share of the vote will be. At this stage, we can't be sure what the actual share of the vote will be by the end of the night, but on the running at the moment, it looks like 39% for Labour. The Conservatives just 4% behind. Our poll said 12%, so clearly a cheering night for the Tories if that continues to be the way the share of the vote goes. The lead there of only 4%. The Green Party way up here on 13%, very much in line with our poll. The Democrats here on 7%, and the others on 6%. Now, Tony King, what do you make of the results so far?
So much of our thinking about these things is influenced by expectations, isn't it? The fact is that the exit poll on Thursday night made it look as though it was going to be an enormous Labour triumph. We're therefore in some danger, I think, of underestimating the extent to which Labour is actually doing well. If that projected share behind you turns out to be the real share at the end of the night, then Labour will have had its first national election victory since 1974, 15 years ago. So it doesn't look at the moment as though it's going to be a wonderful night for the Labour Party, but it's going to be a pretty good night.
Not over 40%, though. They'd like to have got more than 40% of the vote.
They would very much like to have got more than 40%. It's still early days, as you said yourself, and I think we ought not to come to too firm conclusions too soon. Now, the worrying aspect of this, incidentally, from Labour is that all the pre-Thursday polls were suggesting that it was Labour voters who were much more likely to turn out than Tory voters. And if, in fact, the results are as they now appear to be for Labour, then it will look as though that effect has not worked in their favour. The results will be less good than they would have been in an ordinary general election type of contest.
Now, this will be poleaxing for the Democrats. They're in fourth position there with almost half the vote of the Greens.
Yes, going through the results constituency by constituency, it's clear that the Greens have done what most of us thought they were going to do. They have pulled into third place in practically every constituency that they've been fighting. They will have a very healthy share of the vote by the end of the night indeed, and a lot of that vote will have come from the Democrats. There are an awful lot of homeless ex-Alliance voters looking for somewhere to go, and they've temporarily at least found such a place in the Green Party.
Tony King, thank you. David?
Let's have a look then. We've had some more results in, even while Peter has been talking, and see how things are going now. It's just after 11:30. They count these fast because they verified the ballots earlier. So we've got 31 results already in. Labour showing a net gain of 4, taken from the Conservatives, no change in the others. And of the recent results we've had in, Cheshire West, a Labour gain. 102,000, the majority 23,000, a biggish turnout, 40%. Conservatives were vulnerable here. It was 9th most marginal Conservative seat, Labour's number 8 target. And there's the change in the vote in Cheshire West from the 1987, remember, general election, and again the story of the Greens up and the Democrats down. Midlands Central, another Labour gain. Majority of 5,000. It was a Conservative majority of 12,000 last time. Again, the important thing will be what's happened in Midlands Central to the Conservative vote in terms of the share. And here's the story. The Labour Party up 5, the Conservatives down 10, the Green up 21%. These are percentages, of course, not raw figures. It doesn't mean the Greens came in second or first place. And the Democrats are down 17%. Merseyside East, Labour should hold on to this. Their candidate there was deselected, Les Huckfield. Majority 76,000, which was well up on the previous European election in this constituency. Conservatives second on 30,000. And there's the share of the vote. Conservatives down 6, Labour up 7. And now Greater Manchester West, a Labour hold. Barbara Castle's old seat, she stood down after many doughty years fighting Labour's corner in the European Parliament. Democrats and the SDP fighting here and coming after the Democrats in this constituency. Majority of 53,000 against 37,000 at the European election. Again, a biggish turnout. And the change in Greater Manchester West, Conservatives down 11%, Greens up 11%, Labour up 9%. Democrats down 12, the SDP up 2. And Greater Manchester Central, the actual city of Manchester itself, and the fringes around it, Labour hold that, 86,900, the majority 38,000. And the change from 87 from the general election figures in the constituencies that make up Greater Manchester Central, there it is, the Democrats again well down, Conservatives down 6%, Labour up 5% in Greater Manchester Central. Well, now, we've had in 31 results. Mr. Parkinson, can I come back to the point now of how you think the Conservatives have done?
Well, obviously not well. I mean, we've lost seats that we would have hoped to hold, and that's always disappointing. So I don't think anybody in the Conservative Party would think we're having a good night. I certainly don't. But equally, I think one has to just make a very important point, which is that all these comparisons are between these results and the 1987 general election. If you look at the 1984 Euro elections, you'll find, in fact, the Conservative vote fell by comparison with 1983 by about 4%. You'll find the Labour vote was 7% up in 1984 compared with 1983. But 3 years later, when we got into a general election and we got twice as many voters voting, then a different sort of result emerged. So I don't see this as a comparable election with a general election. Only half the number of people vote, and as I say, there is a pattern of Labour doing better in these elections than they've done in the general elections.
What do you say about the complaints from some of your own candidates about the way the campaign was fought by the Conservatives and about the kind of propaganda that was put out by the Conservatives, that it was naive, unsuitable, crass, and all the rest of it that's been said today?
I don't think that influenced this result. I think that what the electorate is telling us is that it doesn't like inflation, it doesn't like high interest rates, it feels insecure, about the economy and people feel their standard of living may be threatened. We recognize all those things. We agree that inflation is a great curse. We're tackling it. And one isn't popular while one's serving up the medicine, but it has to be served up and it has to be taken.
Doesn't like the government, in other words.
At this moment in time, the government isn't as popular as it will be in 2-3 years' time, and as it was a couple of years ago.
Gerald Kaufman, do you think they can make up what they're losing tonight by a general election?
I doubt it at this rate. Of course, one can never tell, and there is time. There's 3 years. But one of the things that Cecil didn't say is that on those 1984 elections that he would like to compare it with, the Conservatives had a majority of votes which would have given them a general election victory then. The swings we're getting from then, as well as from 1987, would very likely return a Labour government. And we've already got 6 gains, which is well on the way to the maximum number of 10 that we'd hoped for at our most optimistic. We are making steady progress. We've been making steady progress since early this year. I like the pace of it. Don't want to go too fast, don't want a surge that can fall again. What we want is steadily to do it, and as you pointed out, the policy review has helped. The leadership of Neil Kinnock has transformed the prospects of the Labour Party, and one of the things that you were kind enough not to say, and one of the things that Cecil was prudent enough not to say, is that what the electorate above all doesn't like is Mrs Thatcher, and that's coming up loud and clear.
David Steele, what about the position of the Democrats? The figures are supporting our poll on the crushing of the Democrats, and as you've seen time and time again in constituencies, some people voting for the Greens apparently instead. Have they taken your place as the party of protest or as the third party?
No, they haven't taken our place as a third party. I think what they have done, as I said earlier, is that in the European elections, where green issues are primarily European, I mean, I think most people now recognise that questions of pollution of the sea or pollution of the air are not capable of being tackled by national governments. There is very much a green tinge throughout the whole of Europe. It isn't just in Britain this is happening, but in every European community country in these elections you find the green vote is rising. I think for understandable reasons, and I think there's a lesson for all of us in politics there, that we have been actually rather slow and I think behind public opinion and not giving enough attention to them. Now we happen to be perhaps the greatest losers by this, for a variety of reasons. The fact that we had no seats anyway at the European level, as I said earlier, the fact there is still lingering unhappiness about what happened in the merger of the two parties. But I cannot believe that we've simply lost all the votes that we had a month ago. We know that hasn't happened, and I think that they will come back when it comes to the elections of actual representatives, particularly when we have sitting representatives in councils and in Parliament.
Sarah Parkin, I'll come back to you in a moment when we've got a few more results in, because I want now just to turn to Peter Snow and have a look at the other side of this story tonight, not just the British side, of course, but the big question of what the European Parliament will be like, whatever you think of the powers it does or doesn't have, and the influence or effect that changes in that European Parliament will have on the way the common market goes. Peter.
Right, the broader European context. Something like 240 million possible voters in Europe. Here are the number of MEPs per country, members of the European Parliament, 518 altogether. The big giant countries, Britain, Germany, Italy and France, have the lion's share of them, 81 MEPs each. Actually, the German MEP bears the biggest burden. He carries about 560,000 voters on his or her back in each constituency. Britain about 530,000 voters, and so on down as the populations decline. 60 MEPs in Spain, 25 the Netherlands, Belgium 24, Greece 24, Portugal. Portugal and Spain joined the common market in 86. They had their own private European election in 87. And here we have Denmark with 16, Ireland with 15, and tiny Luxembourg with 6. Actually, they don't do too badly, the Luxembourg MEPs. They represent only about 37,000 people. And here is where they sit, the great hemicycle in Strasbourg. Extraordinary building, remarkable architecture. That's where the President sits there, the Speaker of the European Parliament. And round here, roughly in political order, sit the various parties of the spectrum. Right over here on the very left of the Speaker, the Speaker's left, 48 Communists. Then we've simplified this down somewhat. We put the Greens over here. They are broadly on the left of the spectrum. They actually sit somewhere at the back here, but just we've singled them out from their rainbow group where they sit so that we can see whether the Greens actually go up or down. Specifically, the Greens in Europe go up or down in number. We expect they're going to go up, of course. Here we have the Socialist parties, 166, the socialist group there. And right over here on the other side of the spectrum, we have the others, the independents, Ian Paisley, other maverick members of the European Parliament, various small groups. The far right over here, sitting right over to the Speaker's right, 16 of them, mainly the National Front in France and some neo-fascists in Italy. Down here, then, we have the centre-right group. Now, this is a huge, great lump of the spectrum here. We've actually put together 4 groups within the centre-right, from the Conservatives right round to the Christian Democrats, but broadly speaking, they represent a large block there of 253 altogether. Now, let's just see on the predictions and projections and actual results we have so far, how it looks as if these party groups are changing. The Communists look like being 2 down. That's a sort of historical trend. Again, the Communists losing seats in the European Parliament. The Greens so far predicted to be up 12. Notice how this little segment here's got a wee bit fatter. 12 more Greens. The Socialists, on the whole, predicted to be 9 stronger by the end of the night. The centre, the others here, up 1. The far right, reckoned to be up 7. The German Republican Party is doing very well in Germany. They're going to send some MEPs to Strasbourg. And finally, the centre-right. Now, the centre-right broadly had a majority before, when you, down 27. With the centre-right broadly had a majority over the left here before. Now it looks very much as if when you add all these up, let's just put them all together, you get the Communists on 46, the Greens on 21, 175 Socialists. When you add those together, probably the centre-right are not going to be able to outvote them. But that is a slight oversimplification, because what frequently happens in the European Parliament is that you get the left-right vote becoming much more muddled than that. You have a broad left, centre-right vote there, very frequently outvoting, for example, the British Tories and the far right here. So it's really very simple and over facile to talk about the European Parliament voting in left-right form all the time. Tony King, what do you think about the movements we've had so far? Definitely a move to the left.
One of the things one ought to bear in mind throughout this evening is that, in fact, we're witnessing not 1 election, but 12 elections. Every European country marches to the beat of its own political drum. Now, there are some Europe-wide factors, and undoubtedly the green surge is one of them. All over Europe, people are concerned about the environment, about the future of the planet, and those people are tending to turn out to vote, and when they do, they're voting green. That's common to Europe. But if you look at what's happening in all the other countries, what you have is voters in that country responding to economic and political circumstances, responding to their own government. So we shouldn't try to make too much of this on a kind of pan-European scale.
But could we not say that there is clearly a movement to the left in the European Parliament that means something more than simply 12 countries moving to the left?
Well, in the first place, not every country is going to move to the left. I think we'll discover by the time the evening's out that that is not, in fact, what's happened. But, of course, there is some significance lying in the fact that the European Parliament, although it doesn't have all that much power, and I think we ought to talk about that a little bit later on, does have some influence on the Commission, on the Council of Ministers. It has increasing formal powers, and there are going to be more left-wing and more green MEPs. And that's important. For one thing, it's going to have an effect on the thinking of Mrs Thatcher's government about Europe. If anything, it will tend to intensify the hostility of the present administration towards much of the things that the community wants to do.
Tony, thank you. David?
The Labour Party, the British Labour Party, is described as the toast of the European socialist movement tonight as celebrations begin in Brussels. And they're saying that when the British votes are all in, the Labour side, or the left side Peter was talking about, is going to make up any losses they've suffered from other parts of Europe as a result of what the UK Labour Party does, though they don't know any more than we do exactly how the Labour Party will do. They're just saying they're gossiping about the size of US gains. Let's have UK gains for Labour. Let's have a look then at some of the European results that we have had in so far tonight, based on projections often, because this is all proportional representation. Mitterrand's Socialist Party suffering in France. Le Pen on the far right may equal his best ever result, and the Greens win their first seats. And this is how it's done. This is the share of the vote in 1989. That's today's election. The right at 30%, the Socialists in second place at 23%, the Greens at 11%, the Centrist Party at 8%. So that's the breakaway from the right. So you've got 2 right parties there. The right on the left there, on the left of the screen, I should say, of Giscard d'Estaing and Chirac, and the centre that believes that the right needs shaking up of Simone Veil, led by her at 8%. Let's see the change now. You can see this is since the election of 1988. It doesn't necessarily affect the number of seats that they get. So there's the damage done to the socialists and the improvement in the Greens' position by 11%. And now Greece. There was the election there, general election as well as European election. It's resulted in a major defeat for Papandreou. PASOK has been overtaken by New Democracy. It's expected that the Greek Prime Minister Papandreou will resign. Germany, which we've heard from a moment ago, the far right support the Republicans surges. Chancellor Kohl is in some difficulties, and there's a suggestion that he'd have to reconstruct his coalition. Let's just see how the change in the vote there has gone. The Christian Democrats at 38%, the SPD, the Social Democrats at 36%, the Greens at 9%, the far-right parties at 8%, and the Free Democrats, Gentra's party, at 6%. And the change since the last general election in 1987, and there are the figures. So the Christian Democrats down, the far-right up at 8%. Now from Bonn, Vivian White has been talking to various people in German politics. Bad night for the government, a good night for the far right. Let's join Vivian White in Bonn. Vivian?
And the story here so far is that the governing CDU-CSU have gone down about 8%, and they've lost, on present estimations, 9 seats in the European Parliament. The SPD, the opposition socialists, are down about 1%. They've lost, we expect, about 2 seats. The Greens have gained a minuscule 0.3 or 4% or so, and they've gained 1 seat. The FDP, the Liberals, who weren't in the European Parliament at all, the Conservatives governing coalition partners, they now are in the European Parliament, according to these seats, according to these results, with a gain of 4 seats. But the big result of the night is that the Republikaner, the extreme right-wing party, they've got about 8% of the vote, and they should have, on that basis, 6 seats in the European Parliament, and they've never been there before, and that's concerned all the other parties. With me now are Elmar Brok of the CDU, who is a Euro MP who's just been returned to the European Parliament, Carsten Vogt from the SPD, a socialist member of the National Parliament, and Petra Kelly, a Green member of the National Parliament as well. How important do you think are the Republicans' results tonight?
I think it's a disaster, and it makes clear to us that we have to explain this situation more to our people, because I think that a right-wing party like the Republicans should not have any future in German politics.
Do you think it means that you, particularly conservatives like yourself, have failed?
It's so that the Republicans have gained from all parties, but especially also from our party. But we have to make clear that the Christian Democrats will not go into a politics which brings us more to the Republicans in order to gain votes there. But we have to convince in a more positive way.
But won't the temptation be to go for the same sort of nationalist, Germans first policy that the Republicans have had?
We see that in the European elections, a lot of people are afraid because of the outcome of the internal market. They don't know enough about it. And if we overcome this situation, I think we can overcome also the Republicans again.
Petra Kelly, your party was once received as quite a shock when it got into the National Parliament. Now the Republicans are in the European Parliament, and they look like getting to the National Parliament too. What's that mean to you?
I'm very shocked, also very saddened by this result. I do believe that the Republicans will get into the next German Bundestag. It makes the situation, I think, even worse, because we do have a growing population in Germany that is not for foreigners staying here. It has made me very sad because I did not expect such a high result, for example, in Bavaria, which is 16%, I think. And I think the Green, where we have stabilized here, we have not made much gain, but on the other sense, I'm very happy tonight because there have been these incredible gains in Great Britain and in France on the Green side, but I'm very sad because of the Republican result.
Carsten Vogt, not just how important tonight, but how important in the future could the Republicans' result be?
The objective result of this big gain of the Republicans is that the Christian Democrats no longer have a majority to govern. If this result in one way or the other would be repeated in the next federal elections, the Christian Democrats could no longer form a coalition with the Liberals, and together with the Republicans, they could not form a coalition, and they will not do it. And another coalition together with any type of the smaller parties is unthinkable.
That means the thing is in your hands then, potentially.
I think that in the future, as I said, we would have liked a better result, but it's quite clear that without Social Democrats, a future German government can't be formed.
Is that for you the message tonight as well?
No, I see that Christian Democrats in a very dangerous and difficult situation in the midterm time, are still the strongest party in Germany. And if an opposition party in such a situation of a national government is not able to gain majority, at which time should they be able to gain majority? I think this gives us a good chance to win again the majority in November 19, the national election.
Petra Kelly, German politics is full of colourful metaphors. There's been talk already of a so-called red-green coalition between politicians like him and politicians like you in Bonn. And there's also been talk today, as these results have been coming in, of a so-called traffic light coalition, red, yellow and green, with the Liberals as well. And that's what Carsten Falk's been suggesting this evening as the only arithmetical possibility for dealing with the situation after the next federal elections. Do you see the Greens playing the power game and going into national coalition?
Well, I think there's going to be a time that we'll have to prevent Republicans from making any type of going into a government, or even from the CDU or CSU position making coalitions with the Republicans. That time could still come. I'm not sure, but it could come. So I think we have to be very careful, first of all, to really educate the public what has happened, educate the European public what has happened to the Republicans. And I think the Green will have to start thinking seriously, not about coalitions themselves, but about tolerating a minority government like the SPD. I think that situation could happen, and I do believe that we're going to have very many problems ahead of us with the Republicans, because they will move into the national parliament.
That's not possible. There's no majority for the Greens and the Social Democrats together.
I want to ask a question of the Socialists and the Conservatives too. This election extraordinarily took place at the end of the week, when there was this huge television show of Mr. Gorbachev going round being cheered to the echo everywhere he went round the Federal Republic. Didn't you think that was a little unfair? Has he helped you do even as well as you have?
I think that Mr. Gorbachev has prepared this visit a long time ago, and I'm sure that this visit has shown that the Federal Republic is able to deal with the politics, which stays very strongly in the Western world, but gives us a chance to work together in East Germany and East Europe to overcome the European division.
Carsten Falk, did Mr. Gorbachev win votes for him, for the governing CDU-CSU?
Yes, he did. For always the governing party will win when such a state visit is happening. But I must say, in spite of it, I was lucky about the results. And we have to make a distinction between party considerations and national long-term policy implications. And long-term policy implications are good. And the short-term implication was that the Christian Democrats were first, while normally we would be first. But this doesn't matter.
Reds, Greens, Blue, thank you all very much. Back to you now, David, in London.
Until the eve of this election, it looked very much as though former Prime Minister Conservative Ted Heath and Mrs Thatcher were at loggerheads over Europe. They briefly patched it up just before polling day. It now seems that they've fallen apart again. Mr Heath has been warning that Mrs Thatcher's attitude to Europe could cost her victory in the next general election. Well, we're joined now by Mr Heath from Westminster. Mr Heath, some Conservatives might say that it was the divisions in the Conservative Party, for instance, the one between you and Mrs Thatcher, not any particular policy issue, that led to this bad result for the Conservatives tonight.
I don't think there's any truth in that whatever. But in any case, I've always stuck to the same policy and the same philosophy as the one with which I took Britain into the European community. The problem arose out of Mrs Thatcher's speech at Bruges, which completely abandoned a large part of our philosophy and our policy. And what she was really declaring was that she didn't want a community, she wanted a free trade area in which you just carried on trade. Well, that isn't acceptable. And I think that all the polls are showing tonight that the British people are more committed than they've been at any time since I took Britain into the community, that they want the community to grow and develop and to Britain to be part of it. But no, I think if you're talking about differences which have caused problems, then it's been the internal problem of the row between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which has broken out on 3 different occasions. And I can't recall in my political lifetime any public row between a Prime Minister and a Chancellor of the Exchequer, let alone 3 of them. And of course it's bound to have a bad influence on public opinion as well as on the markets.
Why do you insist on seeing the result as justification of your view on Europe, when many political observers and politicians say it is simply the latter, the thing you've just referred to, a judgment on the current state of the government at Westminster, nothing to do with what you may think about Europe or what you may think the electorate thinks about Europe?
I think they're quite wrong about that. I campaigned up and down the country. I went up to Inverness and came down, and I've been southeast of London. down in the southeast of England, and I found that people were discussing the European elections. They knew about the European elections, so many people said they didn't even know. I didn't find that to be the case at all. And what they talked to me about was how we could make the community more prosperous and they could benefit from it. Now, I think there is a lesson here, and it may be a lesson which the votes which the Greens are getting should drive home to us, that there are these things about which people are deeply concerned, particularly on the environment. And they don't just want party platform speeches about we are the party of the environment. What they want is to see action done to get rid of dirty beaches, to look after water, and all the other environmental things which concern their daily lives. Now, about this, I think they are in deadly earnest. And all the public opinion polls show again that this is a matter which they think ought to be dealt with on a community basis, because we all affect each other.
What do you think the effect will be on Mrs Thatcher of tonight's result? As you know, Labour are predicted by us at the moment to get 45 seats, with the Conservatives at 32 in the new European Parliament. What do you think the effect of that will be on Mrs Thatcher?
I couldn't possibly answer that question. It may turn out to be somewhat ironical that the balance will be redressed in the European Parliament from the other members of the community, and the Socialists, which frighten Mrs Thatcher so much, won't in fact have a majority in the European Parliament.
Do you think there'll be a change of attitude towards Europe and some of the things you think about as a result of, if you're right, the electorate telling Mrs Thatcher they don't like her stance on Europe?
I think it's got to be a change. It's got to be a change in approach. It's got to be constructive instead of negative. I think the general public are fed up with Euro bashing, community bashing, always blocking. And what people in the street want to see is results coming to them personally. Now, we've had instances recently. We had the case of the warning about dangers to health from tobacco smoking and so on cigarette packets. And the great majority of people want this because they're getting more and more worried about the consequences of cigarette smoking and tobacco smoking. And it also makes it easier for manufacturers to put the same warning on in different languages, and that's done. Why did we set out to block it? We were in a minority of one. And in my experience, if you're going to be in a minority of one in diplomacy, well, then it's better to think again. But people said, well, the government's argument is it doesn't come within the competence of the community, therefore we won't do it. And they say, well, this is nonsense. If we can get things done together, why shouldn't we do it?
But why
and the same applies to the Lingua scheme. They say our children want to learn the languages. Well, we're being stopped, but other European children will go on and learn the language.
But why do you believe this issue, as opposed to the general prosperity of Britain or the state of the economy at the time of the election, is going to be so important that, in your words today, apparently, it would lose Mrs Thatcher the next election?
Well, what I said was that unless we deal with this European problem, and of course I want Conservatives to deal with it. I think the Conservative members of the European Parliament have done an excellent job and they've had no credit for it. But unless the government recognises the importance of this and the other matters which are coming up today, then of course there is the danger that the Conservatives will lose the election. If you take and I think I'm absolutely entitled to warn my own party about this. And if you take the economic situation, which has undoubtedly influenced a lot of people, but which members of the government fail to, or not prepared to recognise, if after 10 years of government you've still got nearly 2 million unemployed, you've got an overall deficit on your trade and other dealings of 15 billion, you've got interest rates up to 14%, and you've got inflation up to 8.3% rising, well, then people are bound to say, after 10 years of government, is this really what we want? And if they're not prepared to come clean on it and say, yes, we recognize these problems and these are the changes in philosophy and approach and policy which we're making to deal with them, unless they do that, then people will say, well, then we better take an alternative course.
Mr Heath, thank you very much. Edward Heath from Westminster. Well, now let's have a look at some more results we've had in, because we've now had 39. We're almost at halfway mark, and we're over the halfway mark of what we're going to get in tonight. 67, I think, is what we're expecting. We've had 39 results in. Labour up 6, the Conservatives down 6. And let's see some of the results that have come in the last half hour or so. Labour have held on to Leeds. Greens in 3rd place there, Democrats in 4th place. Majority of 42,000, much better than they did before. This is the change. Notice, incidentally, a turnout of 37%. Again, all these turnouts are up on Europe, well up on the 33% we've had in the past. Labour up 16%, Conservatives down 18%, Democrats down 20% in Leeds, Thames Valley, Conservatives hold on to this, a rock-solid Conservative area. The key thing will be what's happened to their vote, 26,000 majority, and what's happened since 87 to their vote in Thames Valley. They've gone down 15%, Labour up 9, the Greens up 22, the Democrats down 16. Essex South West, this is a Conservative hold. On the basis of the 87 election, they should have trebled their majority here. Well, it's fallen a bit from 84. Patricia Rawlings is in as the Euro MP for Essex South West on a majority of 9,400. And the change in the vote here, again, since the 87 election, the Conservatives down 12, Labour up 13, Greens up 17, Democrats down 18. Labour hold on to Birmingham West. It was thought it might be a weak spot. It was the third Conservative target in the United Kingdom. Greens go in third place there, Democrats in fourth, 30,000 majority for Labour, and this is the change. Same pattern repeated in the Midlands all the time, that. Very much the same pattern we've had from other seats. Cornwall and Plymouth. Plymouth, of course, is the supposed stronghold of the SDP, but they didn't stand in this seat. It's a mixture of Cornwall and a bit of Devon, the Plymouth part, and the Conservatives hold it. The Democrats in second place there. Democrats did think they would take that. They were going around saying it was the one hope they had. Well, it hasn't turned out. A Conservative majority of 19,000, and the change since the last general election, 6% down for the Conservatives, the Democrats down 9%, Labour up 2%, the Greens up 11% there, and the others at 2%. Leicester, a Labour gain, vulnerable Conservative seat, the second most marginal Conservative one, and Labour's number 2 target, and my goodness, they made it there with a majority of 15,000 against 2,800 Conservative majority in the last European Parliament. And again, the change in the vote. Big increase in the Greens there, 16% or so for the Greens. Democrats down 15%. Tyne and Wear, Labour hold on to this. This is a heartland seat for Labour. And once again, their vote has improved here. Majority of 95,000. The Conservatives in second at 30,000. Not much hope of catching up 126,000 ever, I should think, in Tyne and Wear. And the change since 87, an increase in Labour vote, drop in the Conservative vote, and as was pointed out, this may be because people aren't voting, not necessarily because they're all voting. The turnout is 33%, 52, I can't see the turnout, I'm sorry, I won't try and guess it because I can't find it. Lancashire, Conservatives hold on to this fairly safe Conservative seat. Greens in second place again, Democrats in third place, Greens in third place, Democrats in fourth place. Majority of 5,600 against a majority of 26,000 last time they fought the seat in the European election for the Conservatives. And this is the change. Again, just remembering that these are all made up of 7, 8 or 9 Westminster constituencies, and that's how we arrive at this change from the election of 1987. Norfolk, very safe Conservative area which they should hold easily. Greens in third place, Democrats fourth, SDP in fifth place, Conservative majority of 20,000. And the change in the vote, the worst hit of the Democrats out of this lot, go down 22%, Conservatives down just 9%. And Cheshire East, solid Conservative territory, which is taken by Labour. Unexpected result in Cheshire East. Labour 74,000, narrow victory. Greens again, third place, Democrats in fourth place, a tiny majority, 1,864 on a very big constituency after all. 35% only on the turnout. And the change from the 1987 election, 10% down for Labour, Conservatives down 7, Greens up 12, Democrats down 15. And we've got one more gain coming in. Labour have gained Bristol. And on that note, we go to Peter.
Well, here's the story then in Britain of how Labour look like moving now to winning this election in the sense of having more seats in the European Parliament than the Conservatives. There are the gains, the Labour gains, Cheshire East and West. And what's actually happening is that they're gaining a lot of these marginal Conservative seats. In fact, though, the Labour Party are doing better in the south than they are in the north. I think we'll find one or two Labour gains down here coming up shortly. Leicester, Midlands, Central, south of Scotland. And here are the votes piling in for the parties. 3.5 million nearly for Neil Kinnock, 2.5 million for Mrs Thatcher so far. There's Sarah Parkin's Greens in third place at 1,105,000, and Paddy Ashdown's Democrats just under 500,000. And there go the other parties. There's Gordon Wilson's SNP in front of David Owen's SDP on only 39,495. No results from Wales yet, and 25,527 others. And those are, in terms of percentage, the shares of the vote, 43% Labour so far, this is not the final share yet, 43%, 10% ahead of Mrs Thatcher's Conservatives, 14% the Greens, 6% Penny Ashton's Democrats, and then you have the SNP at 4%, and no score, well, just brought 0.1 or so percent for David Owen, nothing yet from Wales, and the others there. Now, the change that these results so far represent in terms of share of the vote on the general election of 87, 2 years ago, the Labour Party are up 8%, the Conservatives down 9%, the Democrats down 16%, the others up 17%, including, of course, the Green vote there. And that would mean a swing there of 8.5% from Conservative to Labour. And let's just see what that would do to a House of Commons if this had been a general election. People had voted exactly this way in the general election. Let's go inside the chamber of the House of Commons. There's the Speaker's chair there. There's the opposition benches, the government benches there. Mrs Thatcher would, on this vote, be in the opposition. On the opposition benches, there were 280 altogether. Paddy Ashton's Democrats would have just 9, and then the others would build up there to make a total. There's the Welsh Nationalists and the Unionists in Northern Ireland, 28 altogether, the others. And now here's the magic figure, the 326. We've got a little gangway here in the green of the government benches. There's the magic 326 you need to reach an overall majority, and let's see whether Neil Kinnock is through that barrier or not. There he is, and there come the little red men and women. They're through it, 333 just. 317 the opposition, making a Labour majority of 16 when you subtract one from the other. Well now, Tony King, how pleased can Labour be about this?
Peter, we know the qualifications that have to be entered to all this, and if you and I didn't know them, Cecil Parkinson would tell us. Of course it's a mid-term election, and of course there has been differential turnout. Labour voters angry with the government, eager to go and vote and show the government their displeasure. Equally, a lot of Conservatives staying away, unhappy with the things that Cecil Parkinson was referring to earlier on. Also, many of them undoubtedly unhappy with the anti-European seeming stance that the government has been taking. All right, all that said, we enter all the qualifications. The fact is, this is really a very good result for the Labour Party indeed. If at the end of the evening they've got over 40% of the vote, then they will have over 40% of the vote for the first time for Labour in a national election since 1970. If, as looks also possible, the Conservatives are down below 35%, that will be the lowest Conservative share of the vote. And George Bush style, let me ask you to watch my lips. That will be the lowest Conservative share of the vote in a national election in this country in the 20th century.
Indeed, we must underline, mustn't we, that those shares, of course, were in the votes in so far, with only about half the seats counted. But
right.
Indeed.
Were that to happen, that would be the picture. Now, the qualifications are there. This is not a general election. Cecil Parkinson will underline much of what I've just been saying. But it really has been a very good night for Labour indeed so far, even if not quite as good as the NOP exit poll was suggesting.
Thank you, Tony. David?
Lowest share for Conservatives in an election in the 20th century, Mr Parkinson.
Well, as I say, we don't pretend it's a good night for us, but we look at the last Euro elections. Our share of the vote was 38% at that time. 3 years later, it was over 42. Labour was up at nearly 35 at that time. 3 years later, it had fallen by 5. So it's a mid-term, it's a Euro election. Less than half of the voters who will vote in the general election have voted tonight. As Anthony King's just pointed out, those who stayed away are more likely to be disgruntled Conservatives. Those who voted are more likely to be Labour. The abstentions are there, which probably affect things against us in favour of Labour. Having said all those things, it's a warning to the government that we've got to get inflation under control. We've got to stick together. We've got to work hard to make sure that the electorate understands the consequences of electing a Labour government.
You agree with Ted Heath?
No, I don't agree with Ted. I don't actually think that this election was nearly so much about Europe as he does. I recognise his enormous enthusiasm for Europe and his great achievement in getting us into Europe. But I think the Labour Party made this election very, very determinedly a referendum on the government's performance. They didn't even talk about Europe unless they were forced to. Well, the manifesto was 8 pages long, and the whole thing, every Labour person I heard talking in the election was talking about Mrs Thatcher and a referendum on 10 years of Thatcher government.
But what was the Conservative Party talking about?
We were trying to focus on the Euro issues. to point out that the European elections
But you could tell
were
that to
important.
Mr Heath. He didn't agree at all. He says that the whole trouble was that you weren't talking about
we
Europe.
were. We were talking very strongly. Our manifesto was a very full one, a very thorough one, and we tried to make the campaign about Europe. The Labour Party didn't want to, and they succeeded in cashing in on people's dissatisfaction. And I don't take any credit away from them from that. But that was what they did. They set out to poll the disgruntled vote, and they succeeded.
Gerald Kaufman?
Well, he loses either way, doesn't he? Because if he's not accurate and says that we didn't talk about Europe when we did, then we've won on that partly. But if he says, as he insists, that it was nothing to do with Europe and we weren't talking about Europe and we weren't interested in Europe, but we were trying to get people to vote against Mrs Thatcher, then we've done very well, haven't we? Because if Mrs Thatcher and the Conservative government's incompetence and heartlessness was the issue, then all I can say is that this is a very good result for Labour on the basis of a rejection of the Conservative government and everything they stand for.
So you'd rather have it seen that way around?
I don't mind. I don't mind. Either way, Cecil loses. If it's on Europe, we win, because our attitude is much more positive. And indeed, during... Oh, yes, Cecil. Oh, yes. All of the things that you vetoed and were against, the languages and the social charter and the purification of rivers...
General, may I just make one point? About a third of your candidates are violently anti-Europe, want to take Britain out. We produced a list of them.
Well,
they form a special group. They are totally opposed to Europe.
Really?
They are extreme left-wingers, totally opposed to
Mr. Corbyn,
Europe.
it is true that the Labour MEPs are led by an anti-EEC man, isn't it? Not often realised.
He is a man who was on our policy review group and subscribed to the policy review group assertion that Labour would stay in the European community, which is in our policy review, which the National Executive approved. And what we've said two things in this election. We've said vote for a social dimension, vote for a progressive Europe and against the Tories vetoing all these things, but also vote against the Tory government and Thatcher. And we've won on both counts.
John Cole, what do you make of these arguments and Ted Heath? How do you think people were actually voting, if it's possible to tell?
Well, whoever's credit or discredited is put down to, I think the issue in this election was very largely Mrs Thatcher.
I have to stop you. We have a result coming. Sorry, I swear to come back to you. We have to go to North Wales for a result, and we join Nick Clark there.
Yes, David, well, we're expecting the result any minute now. You can probably see there the returning officer. That's Philip McGreevy, the Chief Executive of Delyn, the district of Delyn. We have a little bit of microphone hum problem. This is a seat of intense interest, which could, on paper, have been a four-way marginal between the sitting Tory MEP, Labour, Plaid Cymru, and the Democrats, although we do know that the Democrats' vote appears to have gone very seriously down. Here comes the result.
Patrick Henry Walter Adams, Green Party, 15,838. Beata Ann Brooks, Conservative Party candidate, 79,000.
Can't hear it.
79,178. Robert Keith Marshall, Social and Liberal Democrat, 10,056. David Ellis Thomas, Plaid Cymru, Wales in Europe, 64,120.
A slightly quizzical look from Mr. Ellis Thomas, who was hoping to have won this seat. A great deal was invested by the party in it.
Anthony Joseph Wilson. Anthony Joseph Wilson, Labour, 83,638.
That's a win for the Labour Party. They needed a swing of only about 3.5%, and it's been achieved despite the excellent showing by Plaid Cymru.
Anthony Joseph Wilson has been duly elected to serve as member for the North Wales constituency. Dated this.
So Labour comes up from third place to take Wales North, a Labour gain with 83,638. The Democrats go to the very bottom, fifth in the poll, They were second last time round. The Greens in fourth place, Plaid Cymru in third place. Labour majority of 4,460 on a big turnout, 47%, nearly half the electorate voting. And this is the share of the vote in the election, done on Thursday, of course, counted just now. 33% for Labour, Conservatives 31, Plaid Cymru 25, the Greens on 6, Democrats on 4, and the change since the 1987 general election. There's the story. Democrats down 16% in fifth place, Plaid Cymru up 11% in third place. Now, John, I interrupt you to go to that result. What were you in the middle of?
Yes, I think the spotlight in this election was on Mrs Thatcher, whether because of events or because of her own personality. You see, I was telephoning around Conservatives this evening while I was waiting to come into the studio, and what I found was the criticism of her for negativism on Europe. They say, people were saying that she had done very well on the CAP and in Britain's budgetary contributions, but that she now wasn't going with the grain of public opinion. But more seriously than that, of course, the Conservatives are suffering because of the economy. What Ted Heath and Cecil Parkinson have recited earlier, the difficulties over inflation, over trade deficit, over interest rates and mortgages, all the rest, all the things we're familiar with, have turned against the Conservatives. But where Mrs Thatcher has been thrown into the centre of this is because of the disagreements between numbers 10 and 11 Downing Street. The people I was talking to felt that she had not acted swiftly and decisively enough to end those. Now, to be fair, there is a bit of a law of diminishing returns applying here, because the Chancellor and Prime Minister, heaven knows, have said enough times that they've no fundamental disagreements on economic policy. But Sir Alan Walters is there, and people are saying that he is playing different tunes in private, in city boardrooms and lunches and so on. Unfortunately, every time the Chancellor and Prime Minister say that they really do agree, the markets don't seem to believe it, and the media express scepticism or even cynicism. And therefore, it doesn't seem that they can ever get that one right. And one Conservative said to me, they must simply draw a line under it. Unless they throw arms around each other and kiss, they're not going to kill this story.
Let's just turn to the other story, the way that the Greens almost everywhere, and particularly in North Wales, have taken the place of the Democrats. Sarah Parkin, you haven't had a word for a bit. What do you make of this now? You've got, you're running at about an increase of what, 13–14%, and you stand at about 14% share of the vote.
Yes, well, I mean, of course, I'm absolutely delighted, and it does show that your exit poll so far is holding up.
As far as you're concerned, it's holding up well.
Very well indeed. I think there's 2 points to be made. I think, first of all, I'm not certain that it's all coming from the Democrat. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a shuffle through the other parties for the votes that are coming to the Greens, and I think that is an important point to make. I think in the South we're taking it from the Conservatives, and maybe more in the North we're taking it from the Democrats. And I think it is also, it's not a protest vote. I think if there has been a protest vote, it has gone to Labour, because as they said, they ran this election campaign as a referendum on Mrs Thatcher, so the protest vote against Mrs Thatcher has probably gone directly to Labour.
Why shouldn't people who, particularly in the South, where you appear to have done so well, and Peter Snow has... Well, let's just have a look, actually, at Peter's figures and then come back to the discussion.
Very quickly, here come the Greens almost from nowhere. Here they are then, in the various regions. In Scotland, the Greens have just 7% of the share of the vote so far. In the north of England, the Greens have 12%. In the Midlands, as it goes down, so it gets greater. In Wales, Wales they have 9%. In the Midlands, the Greens are on 16%, and in the south, the Greens are on 19%. So there is the share of the vote taken by the Greens as you go down south, so they get greater. David,
do you have? I hate to put it to you that you might have another way of showing this, but do you have a way of demonstrating whether that is at the expense of the Conservatives in those areas? Whether people are failing to vote for Labour in the South and choosing to vote for the Greens instead?
I think the answer is it varies from place to place, but certainly it's at the expense of the Conservatives and, of course, the Democrats.
David Steele.
Yes, I think it is quite considerably at our expense. I don't say totally. And I think when you look at... I was saying earlier that it couldn't be all that different, our real position, from what it was a month ago. I'm heartened by the fact that on Thursday, when these Eurovotes were taking place, there was also the Vauxhall by-election and there were local government by-elections. And our vote in those was of the order between 19 and 21%. In other words, about the same that it was a month ago. So I suspect that what is happening is that a lot of our people, who are in any case, we are a fairly green party, a lot of them have said, well, you don't have any Euro seats and you're not likely to get any, and this is an occasion when we can register our concern on this particular issue.
Not very helpful to you.
No, I'm not saying it is, but I'm trying to be helpful.
It doesn't matter.
I'm trying to be helpful to you in analysing why this has happened, and I'm demonstrating that it is not affecting our vote in the parliamentary and in the local government elections, and I don't think it will, particularly next time round, provided, you know, we get our act together a bit more effectively than we've been able to do so far.
Where is it going wrong?
Well, I think it was only just a few weeks ago that David Owen announced his withdrawal, or his party's withdrawal from national party status. That came too late to help us, I think. But I think now that that is clear, we will have a much better position.
Doesn't it seem odd to desert a party that hasn't got a chance of winning a seat in the European Parliament for another party that doesn't have a chance of winning a seat in the European Parliament? I don't understand the logic.
For this reason, that the Greens, you can make a particular point by voting for a Green party, as people are doing throughout the whole of Europe, and expressing irritation that we haven't done more as governments, as parliaments, as Europeans on the ecological issues. I think it's perfectly understandable.
Do you think people are going to the Greens because of their unilateralist policy and because they want to pull Britain out of NATO, Mr. Kaufman?
I don't
and because they're deserters from the left of the Labour Party, like David Blunkett, I think, was suggesting there might be some?
I don't think people are going to the Greens because of any specific policies that the Greens are adopting. I think if you went out into the street and asked people exactly what politics the Green Party stood for, they wouldn't know. I think they're voting for the Greens because of their name, because there is a very profound and a very understandable concern about the deterioration of our planet. And people are very worried indeed about that, and rightly so. And they want international action on it, which we can get through the community, the Commonwealth, the United Nations, in other ways. And therefore, they're attracted by the name. And I don't blame them, and I give credit to the Greens for their performance in this election. But when a general election comes, when everybody knows that there's no possibility of the Greens winning a general election, or possibly even returning a member of Parliament, then people with those concerns will come to the Labour Party, because they know when it's a choice between Labour and the Conservatives don't give anything for the environment. Look at what they did on tobacco, for example.
Sarah Parkin.
Well, I mean, this is nonsense. I don't think people are voting at all for a name. What they're voting for is that they no longer believe that the traditional parties are able to address the real problems that we face. And the Green Party in Britain has existed since 1973. And we have had a very strong programme, a very comprehensive programme on all issues, which has gone out in every election, in our leaflets, in our manifestos. I think people are very clear about what they're voting for. And I think it's interesting, especially looking at Peter Snow's charts, how very difficult it is to imagine that perhaps the left-right divisions in politics are breaking up, because the Greens are not a party of the left. They're very much a party about the real problems we're facing in the future. And our agenda, if you like, is now the political agenda. And the Green Party has been asking for this agenda now for 16 years. And so we are now saying the time has come to look at the proposals and the solutions that we're offering. And I think this sort of hedging by all the other parties is not good enough. And David Steele says he's got green policies on his manifesto. This is not true. I mean, it's very much treated the green programme like a menu and taken off the bits that don't cause too much ideological indigestion. And all the parties have done that to a certain extent. And now I think the time has come to take the Green programme seriously, and I hope that this is what will happen. And I finish off by pointing out that the Vauxhall by-election, we polled 6%. So it does look as in a tight election, and it does look as though people are voting Green because they know that we're addressing the real problems we face.
Good. Well, let's have a look now at the European results again. We've had some more figures in, various counts going on, various predictions going on. First of all, in Spain, good news for González. His support drops. This is the party in power, of course, but not as much as he thought. A disappointing result for the Popular Party to the right. So that's the exception to the rule that everybody's been voting against their governments. Socialists on 40%, Popular Party on 21%, Christian Democrats on 7%. Popular Party is the right-wing party. And the change from the last general election in Spain, there's been a fall in the socialists, you see, but nothing very considerable. And now, from Spain, we move to the Netherlands. And they had a political crisis. Prime Minister Lubbers had problems with the Liberals, who pulled out of the coalition, and the Liberals have suffered as a result. This was over a proposal to make motorists pay for the damage they were doing to the environment. So it was a very green policy. Greens don't do well in Holland because all other parties are said to be so green it doesn't, it's not worth being green. They're at 7%, as you see. Christian Democrats at 35, Labour at 31. And this is the change. And watch what happened to the Liberals in Holland. Down 4% there, and Labour down 3%. And now Denmark, the only country that actually has a named anti-EEC party, and it's lost support. The Conservative Party may lose its seats. Social Democrats have done well. Let's just see the share of the vote in Denmark. Anti is what we call the anti-EEC party at 17%, and have a look at the change there. Social Democrats down 2, anti up 17. Liberals just staying absolutely the same. Conservative People's Party down 5%. Progressive Party, or Progress Party, down 2%. And now Portugal, a new entry with Spain into the EEC in 1986. The ruling Social Democrats Party popularity is slumping, the Socialists gaining some ground in Portugal. Social Democrats being to the right, of course, of the Socialists. Social Democrats at 33%, Socialists at 28%, Christian Democrats there at 14%, the Communist Party at 14%, and the change from the 87 general elections, the same as ours, the last one that they had in Portugal. There's the change. Big fall for the governing party, the Social Democrats in Portugal, bearing out the thesis of anti-government votes. And now Italy, which effectively has no government, as a caretaker government, as so often in Italy, and this has provided no solution. Crax's Socialist Party has failed to make gains. Greens have won their first Euro seat in Italy. Christian Democrats, 32%. Communist Party, 27%. Socialists at 15%. And the change since the 1987 general election there, small drop in the Christian Democrats. The Greens go up 4% and get 1 seat in the European Parliament. I think they actually get rather more than that. I'm not quite sure. Peter.
Right, well, let's go back inside this extraordinary chamber, the hemicycle in Strasbourg, and see what the latest projections for the changes are. Now, watch these segments, and you'll see them change just a little bit now. Watch the Greens here get bigger as they go up by 18. 18 more Greens expected in Strasbourg. The Socialists, another 10, slightly more red in the hemicycle there. Let's go over here. The others, up. Oh, no change. The far right are going to go up, mainly the Germans there, the Republican Party in Germany. The far right, we heard from them earlier. And here's the centre-right going down by 30. Don't forget, though, I was saying that there is, of course, not a simple left-right balance in the European Parliament, even if now there's perhaps beginning to look like a majority for the broad left. Even so, very frequently, great parts of the broad left do vote with parts of the right, as this picture here shows. Now, of course, this is not just about the European Parliament, it's also about the performance of governments and parties inside European countries. And here is the swing in each country, the left-right swing, from the last general election until this European election tonight. So here we have the swing in the United Kingdom. This is the biggest swing to the left, appears to be the 9% now swing to the Labour Party in Britain. The latest swing we have is 9%. The biggest swing then to the left is in Britain. In Portugal, the swing is 7%. Down there you have the Silva government, the Social Democrat government losing ground. The Social Democrats in Portugal, rather right-wing Social Democrats, losing ground now to the Socialists. That's the second biggest swing in Europe then. Here we have the rather complicated Italian swing that David was talking about, the combined movements there, showing a 5% swing to the left in Italy. In Spain, Felipe González not doing quite so badly as many expected, holding up quite well the socialist vote there. A broad swing to the left in Spain, in spite of what some people thought was a swing to the right there. In Belgium, there's a little swing to the left in Belgium. And then we go on to the next few countries. In Germany, only 1%. That's largely accounted for by the fact that although the Christian Democrats are down, the right, the Republican Party, is considerably up there. So there's not much of a swing to the left in Germany. It's made up, the drop in the government vote there is largely made up by the movement to the right, the Republicans. So you've got a net swing of 1% to the left in Germany. In the Netherlands, only 1%. The swing's getting smaller here. Now we have the swings to the right. In Denmark, a movement to the right of 2%. And in France, on the whole there, the parties of the right making the gains at the expense of the socialists. So a 4% swing there. And in Greece, of course, as expected, a major swing to the right there. Andres Papandreou, the socialist prime minister, losing votes to New Democracy in Greece. David.
Even the most diligent Tory MEPs said they were puzzled by the Tory campaign slogan, stay at home on June the 15th and you'll live on a diet of Brussels. You have to work it out. And one or two said, please paper this thing over in my constituency because nobody understands it, least of all me. Brussels, of course, being at the centre of the EC. Jeremy Paxman is there tonight. He has some reports from people there, including a report on the state of affairs in Greece, where the government appears to have suffered a defeat. Jeremy.
Well, the situation here in Brussels, as the results come in, and as you can see behind me, they're being reported to the different countries of the European community, is that so far anyway, the much vaunted, much predicted swing to the socialists doesn't really seem to have taken hold across Europe. The most interesting results, actually, as far as many people here are concerned, are the results in Britain, which are awaited with great eagerness and interest. Of course, the other interesting results are the results in France, where the Greens seem to have done terribly well, in fact giving them seats in the European Parliament with a smaller share of the vote, apparently, than the Greens polled in Britain. But then everywhere else in Europe has proportional representation, and the UK doesn't. Now, a little earlier, I spoke to two prominent Europeans and asked them what they made of the picture so far. And with me now are the Belgian Prime Minister, Wilfried Martens, and the European Commissioner, Bruce Millen. Mr. Martens, it's a very early stage of the evening, but from what we know so far, what do you make of what's been happening throughout Europe? Or is it not possible to see a European pattern?
A lot depends on the result in Great Britain. If what we have as prognosis is exact, then there could be a left majority in the European Parliament. I don't know if the Socialist Party and the Greens and the Communists could form a majority, if they have the will to do that. But if the figures we have here are exact figures, then you could have a change in that Parliament.
Now, if there is a bigger socialist grouping within the Parliament, what is that going to mean for relations between the Parliament and, for example, the British government, Bruce Millen?
Well, it's a bit early to say. I think it would be useful to have some more of the results in, but we now have quite a complicated relationship, as you know, between the Parliament on the one hand, the Commission and the Council of Ministers. I think if you have a change, any kind of change in the Parliament, and certainly if it's a change to the left, then there will certainly be greater pressure from the Parliament on social measures, environmental measures and so on. That does affect the relationship, and I suppose it has an impact on the British government as on other governments.
And if we were to get to a situation where the Social Charter, for example, as proposed for 1992, were to be rejected by Mrs Thatcher, the Parliament wouldn't stand for that, would they?
Well, following from the Social Charter as such, there will be quite a number of detailed legislative measures. Some of these can go through the Council of Ministers on a qualified majority, others will require unanimity. But I think the whole question of the Social Charter, in a sense, is really 11 governments against one, with the Parliament, even on its present composition, I think, being largely in favour of the Social Charter. I think a change in the parliamentary composition, a move towards the left, would probably increase pressure on the British government and any other government that might have a certain reluctance towards acceptance of the Social Charter.
Now, Mr Martens, what do you make of the fact that the British people appear not to have bought Mrs Thatcher's vision of Europe?
I don't know what is the reason of these defeats. Is there an internal question or tendency which gives you this result in the European election? We also in Belgium have strong internal problems which are at the basis of the result of today. So it is impossible for me to say what is the reason in your country. But on the European Parliament, I would say that I think that with this result, we need a more active policy in the Parliament. We need more agreements between the groups. It seems me not sensible that the Socialists would form a majority with the Communists and the Greens. But I think that we will need more agreements, political agreements, between, for example, the Socialist group, the Christian Democratic group, and the Liberal group.
But there is no question in your mind, either of you, that the European Parliament, as it appears to be going to be constituted, is going to seek greater and greater powers.
I think that this Parliament, with this composition, will see greater powers.
Bruce Miller?
I think that is, yes, that is going to happen. Just on the question of coalitions, as it were, there was a good deal of agreement and a cooperative relationship between the Socialist Group and the Christian Democrats in the last Parliament. I would imagine that on many issues, including, incidentally, the Social Charter, that cooperation will continue, but the grouping taken together will be a rather stronger one than it was in the last Parliament. And I think Parliament is increasingly exercising the powers that it has. It's done it very constructively in the past, and I think it's going to continue to do that, and probably, as has just been said, look for increased powers in the future.
That was Bruce Millen and Wilfried Martin still talking a short time ago. Now, of course, apart from the direct elections to the European Parliament, there have also been various other votes going on in Europe. One of them in Italy, for example, was a referendum on whether the question of whether the Italian government should cede more power to Europe. In Greece, though, there was a national election going on today where the government of Prime Minister Papandreou, a socialist government, has been under a great deal of pressure recently for two reasons. One, because of a financial scandal in which various members of the government appear to be implicated and large amounts of money appear to have disappeared through a bank in Crete, and because, of course, of his well-known affair with a former air hostess. Now, it appears that he has not got the resounding endorsement of the Greek people which he wanted, and I asked a Greek journalist, why? Now, Mr. Avram, we all know, of course, about Mr. Papandreou's affair with the air hostess. We know about the financial scandal. Why was it, in your judgment, that the Greek people turned against him?
My opinion is that after some years of being in power, Papandreou was implicated, not he himself directly, but some members of his government or some prominent members of his party were implicated in the scandal, financial scandal named Koskota scandal.
Now, the man who has run him so close, Mr. Mitsotakis, what sort of a government is he going to form, and would you expect it to make for big changes as far as Greece and the EC or Greece and Britain is concerned?
Well, I think that there will be a change in the internal policy rather than the foreign policy. The foreign policy of Greece is, I think, is always following the same path. That is, there are some problems, big problems of Greece, like relations with Turkey, Cyprus, and so on. And there will be no great change in the foreign policy, but in the internal policy, I think there will be in some extent, a change.
And as far as the celebrated affair with the air hostess went, on Mr. Papandreou's part, the Greek people have shown themselves to be rather tolerant, have they?
Well, it is a personal affair, I think, and there was no very big implication about that affair with Papandreou, since there was the great affair of the financial scandal. But the affair with the air hostess was a personal affair, I think.
Mr. Avram, thank you very much. Well, that's how it looks at the moment in Brussels, David. For the moment, though, back to you in London.
Jeremy Paxman from Brussels. Stephen Milligan is our BBC Europe correspondent. I want to ask you one very simple question. If it's true that the British are represented in Europe by a majority, as we're predicting, of 45 Labour seats against 32, what effect is it going to have on the Prime Minister's stance in Europe? What's going to happen when the Prime Minister goes back to Europe and says, this is what British government wants, this is what we feel, in the rather forceful way that she does, and they look at the way Britain's voted and say, well, Mrs Thatcher, you've got 45 Labour MPs here and 32 Conservative MPs, why should we think that what you're saying is really the views of the British people?
Well, she is going back to Europe in 7 days' time for the Madrid summit, where Britain's going to be in a minority on two major issues. One, the question of monetary union, where the rest of the community is very keen to forge ahead, And secondly, on the question of the social charter. These are the ideas that the European Commission has put forward for social harmonisation. Mrs Thatcher is going to fight very hard on both those issues, but I think it's natural to presume that other European leaders are going to turn to her and say, Prime Minister, on these issues you don't even have the support of your own people. Look at the result of the European election on this issue. Labour has done very well. I don't think for a minute that Mrs Thatcher is going to accept that argument, but it will certainly be put to her. I think on the actual results of the Parliament itself, it's rather interesting. I've just been doing some calculations. It seems to me that the Socialists, or the left and the right, will have exactly equal numbers of seats in the new European Parliament, 246 on my calculation, which presents a rather interesting picture because it means there'll be level pegging, and on some issues, notably the choice of the new President of the Parliament could be deadlocked.
Yes, the Socialists are saying they were going to challenge Lord Plumb's presidency of the Parliament, but I rather thought Lord Plumb was standing down.
Lord Plumb will stand down, and there are two Conservative figures who had their eye on the post. The first is the former French President, Monsieur Giscard d'Estaing, and the second is Mr. Leo Tindemans, the Belgian Foreign Minister. But on these figures, it looks as though they won't be able to muster a majority, and the balance will be held by a small group of others, including people like Ian Paisley. So there may be some rather interesting courting of votes going on.
Professor Parkinson, just on that one point about how Mrs Thatcher and Sir Geoffrey Howe will be received now when they go back to Europe in a minority.
Well, I don't think most of the heads of government will accept that the general election was of no consequence and that the Euro election expresses a true view of the people. I think if they sit round the table together, there'll be pretty fair unanimity about that, that the people express their view about their government and who they want to govern them in the general elections in the respective countries.
What, and they make
I think she'll get a very sympathetic hearing
all?
if she makes that point.
And they make no comment in Europe at
well,
all when they
there'll be very few prime ministers there who haven't had a movement against them in the course of these elections.
This is the line I see that the chairman of the Conservative Party is taking, a movement across Europe against the government of the day. David Steele, if you could just hang on a moment, we have to do some British results again, and I'll come back to you next time we're round the table here. Let's have a look now at some more British results that have come in. We've now had 59, we've got 20 to come, I think, in the United Kingdom, 58 results in. And we're now showing a Labour 9 gains. Remember, we were talking about 12 gains, perhaps overall, we're still predicting. Conservatives down 9. And of the latest seats in Bristol, this has been a Labour gain. It should have been a safe Conservative seat. Majority for the Labour Party of just 9,000. The Greens again in third place, Labour, Dems and Democrats in fourth place. Biggish turnout, 40%, and this is the change from the general election in the constituencies that make up that area. Down 12%, the Conservatives, Greens up 18, Democrats down 19%. London East, which is a Labour hold, one that was thought to be vulnerable, not at all vulnerable as it turns out. Greens again in third place, Democrats in fourth, a majority of 27,000. Considerably up on their 84 European result here, and an increase in their vote from the 1987 election for Labour of 17% in the east of London. This is the whole of the East End. It goes out as far as Dagenham. Durham, a Labour hold, a Labour heartland seat. It's 8th safest as it happens, and you can see why, 124,000 for Labour, the Conservatives at 37,000. But once again, if we look at the change of the share here, against the 1987 election, with that majority of 86,000, you'll see that Labour has picked up in this heartland area by 14%. Conservatives have dropped by 8%, the Greens are up 9%, and the Democrats down 16%. And now we have the result coming from London West, and Ian Smith is down there at the count.
Trendon, Conservative, 78,151. Elliot Michael Norman, Labour, 92,959. Howell Davis, Germany. Howell Davis, Jeremy, the Green Party, 32,686.
It's a very good result for them to hold it. It's particularly satisfactory for Labour in light of the fact that this Euro constituency has 8 Westminster MPs.
Harry
which
John,
6
Social and Liberal Democrats, 9,309. Rogers Davis John, Social Democratic Party, 2,877. And I declare that Michael Norman Elliott has been duly elected to serve as representative to the European Parliament.
This was the top Conservative target in this election. It's the 5th most marginal seat in the Euro constituencies, and the Conservatives really hoped that they would take this, but have failed to do it. Labour 92,000, the Conservatives 78,000, the Greens 32,000, the Democrats at 9, the SDP at 3, a Labour majority of 14,000, again a highish turnout at 42%. This is the share of the vote in this election in 1989. The Conservatives did well here. It swung heavily Conservative in 87. Now have a look at what's happened since 87. Labour has recovered, up 13%, the Conservatives down 11, Greens up 14, Democrats down 18. Worth saying, of course, that it's a much, much smaller turnout than a general election, and that may explain some of these changes. However, that's the position. Peter.
Well now, there is what the battleground looked like before tonight. The Labour seats in the minority, the Tory seats in the majority. 45 blues, 32 reds. And there's the meeting point there. There are the unsafest of the Labour seats and the unsafest of the Tory seats. Labour's task to get down to the bottom of this column here in order to win the majority of the seats. These are the more comfortable and safer Tory seats. So we've had a lot of results in. There they go. Look at the red swathe going down there. 59 results in so far. There they are, the Tories holding just one of the seats so far in that vital action area there and losing some of the much more comfortable seats even beyond that. Here are the gains flashing, the little white bubble there flashing to show you where the Labour gains are. There they go, right the way down, even as far as number 50, Cheshire East there. And now let's fill in the forecast results in the remaining undeclared seats. There they go, and you see we're still forecasting one or two Conservative holds here in London, but here come the forecast gains right the way down there. And so that's the picture then in our battleground as we expect to see it by the end of the night. But the interesting thing is what's happening to the swing all over the country. It's very, very varied. In Scotland, the swing is only 1%. Not perhaps very surprising because, of course, there's not much for Labour to do in Scotland. They're also fighting the SNP up there, and they've got most of Scotland already. So 1% swing to Labour in Scotland. In the north, where there are a large number of valuable Tory seats to pick up in the general election, the swing is 9%. In Wales, it's rather less at 5%. In the Midlands, the swing is a whole 11%. And in the south, and this is where it really will count in a general election, if there's a major general election swing of 10%, that will do Labour a lot of good. And now, if you just watch here, you'll see which gains, how many gains, Labour would pick up in each region for that swing. And as you can see, that swing in the north brings in 34, but that hefty swing in the south brings in 46 gains for Labour if this were a general election. Now, Labour needs 97 gains to win a general election. As you can see, it'd quite clearly be through 97 gains. So on that kind of swing, never mind Scotland, doesn't matter so much because there aren't that many Tory seats to pick up in Scotland. That kind of swing in the vital north and south will bring Labour the seats it needs. Tony King.
Peter, for almost a generation now, the Labour Party has had two credibility problems, not one. Problem number one has been to persuade large numbers of people that Labour was fit to govern, that this was a party you could go out and vote for and you weren't taking any terrible risks with the country's future. Credibility problem number two has been to persuade people that Labour, rather than the Liberals or the Democrats or the Alliance or whatever they were called, was the party that you had to vote for if you wanted to get the Conservatives out. And on the basis of tonight's result, surely it's clear that Labour is making modest but very real progress under both of those two separate headings.
And isn't the fascinating thing about those figures that Labour is coming back in the south, where up to now it's failed to come back?
That was absolutely essential. Nothing has damaged the Labour Party over the last few years more than the fact that it has had almost no seats in the south of England. Why not? Partly because people have insisted on voting Conservative, partly also because there have been these huge defections to the old alliance. And it looks as though Labour is beginning, at any rate, to haul some of that support back.
Tony, thank you. David?
Well, we're joined now by the Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe, who's down in Westminster. Sir Geoffrey, you know, presumably, the results that we're predicting at any rate, the Conservatives at 32 and Labour at 45. Do you think this was a campaign that was mishandled by the Conservative Party and in particular by the Prime Minister?
No, I don't. I think the campaign that we fought was clearly directed to emphasise the importance of the European Parliament, emphasising the importance of the programme we were putting forward, and seeking to prevent the European Parliament falling into the hands of a left-wing socialist majority. We haven't succeeded in doing that as far as Britain is concerned, and that's disappointing, obviously. But I think that the interesting thing, adding to the lessons we were just being told by Anthony King, is the third one, that if the Labour Party have rallied to the extent he's described, it also becomes clear that they are now the party that people need to vote against. And I think that's a very important message to get across. If you were to actually regard this, as I think you should regard it, as a mid-term kind of national-scale by-election, then I think it's not at all a surprising result and not really too bad a one. You'll find a very substantial swing away from tonight's results if one got to a general election.
What do you say to Mr. Heath's charge that it was Mrs. Thatcher's attitude to Europe that people didn't like, that it was the divisions between herself and the Chancellor of the Exchequer that they didn't like, and that if she doesn't mend their ways, you're going to lose the general election?
Well, it's not a charge I can accept, obviously. Ted Heath has a great deal for which he can take credit, notably our presence in the European community at all. But he hasn't been conspicuous for the frequency of his praise for the Prime Minister during the last 10 years, and one has to put that in perspective. The government actually fought the most positive, the most coherent campaign of any party, actually on the European issues. We went out time and time again, arguing for our kind of Europe, saying it was important to get people to vote that way.
Can you tell me how stay at home on June the 15th and you'll live on a diet of Brussels is a coherent party slogan?
I think it's quite a coherent one, actually.
Why were so many MEPs on the Conservative side saying they objected to it and didn't want it in their constituencies?
It's a slogan that you can understand, at least, because what it's saying is it's important to vote. It's important to vote to avoid allowing the European Parliament to be dominated by a majority of left-wing parties. That's the central message. We wanted to get an increased turnout. Well, we've achieved that, but not, I'm afraid, as much as we should like on our side.
Could I quote Mr. Cottrell, who was defeated in Bristol, the Tory candidate there, who said these advertisements were crude, ludicrous, and an insult to the intelligence of the voters?
Well, he's entitled to his opinion. The advertisements are chosen by those who advised the party at central office on the advertising campaign. The election was actually being fought by candidates and by those of us who were speaking up and down the country on the strength of the election manifesto, which has been generally acknowledged to be a comprehensive, full and impressive one.
But you
that's the basis on which the election was being fought.
But you can't claim a splendid campaign, can you, when you're the minority party now in Europe representing Britain?
Look, in Britain there are two effective parties. Only one can be a majority at any one time. We've been majority for the last 10 years. It happens to have moved against us a little this time. That's a bad thing, of course. But it's not a surprising thing after 10 years in office, election taking place in mid-term, when we're having to put through a number of our most difficult policies, when we're having to have high interest rates to be sure we retain our success against inflation. It's not surprising that you get a protest vote in a nationwide by-election. I think the remarkable thing is that it's been on such a modest scale compared with what might happen, what might have happened, for example, under the last Labour government.
Do you think the perceived differences between the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister played an important part in people? It's often said people don't like governments that appear to be divided. It doesn't really matter what the issue is. If they appear to be divided, they vote against them.
Well, let's be clear, first of all, there's no division on the central features of policy. We've got a strong economic policy with a high interest rate currently because we're determined to get on top of inflation. That's the policy of the entire government. We have the same attitude towards the Central European questions. I think that's how it's perceived. I don't think there's been any dramatic swing against us. If you come back to the proposition that until a few weeks ago, most commentators were saying that for this government to have held its leading place in the opinion polls as well as we have was an astonishing achievement. Everyone would have expected us to move into a negative position on the opinion polls at this stage in the Parliament. The surprising thing is that it's taken so long for that to happen.
How do you think the government should respond to this defeat tonight?
Well, it should respond by quite calmly reflecting on what lessons there may be to be learned from it, of course, being determined to maintain its effectiveness and unity, pressing ahead with the key parts of our domestic manifesto, and pressing ahead in Europe with the very detailed, comprehensive set of programmes that we set out in our manifesto. It's the most complete, most European manifesto, I would judge, of all the parties competing in these European elections this time.
Do you think learning what lessons there are to be learnt might include a change of positions at the top in the cabinet, a reshuffle?
I don't think that's a lesson that should necessarily be learnt at all. That's a matter that arises, of course, from time to time. But I think that the central thing is we have got a strong government, an experienced government, a government that is quite clear about the policies it's following, which are relevant and effective in Europe as well as in this country.
Are you expecting a reshuffle?
I don't make any comments on matters of that kind.
Sir Geoffrey, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Peter.
Well, now, David, Wales has traditionally been the Labour Party's second best region, really. Powerful lead of the vote, about 70% lead of the last general election. And now the Wales share in the 3 seats in Wales declared so far, North Wales and 2 down there in the south, is a 50% Labour share of the vote, 23% the Conservatives, way behind. Plaid Cymru not doing too badly on 13%. The Greens on 10% in Wales, and the Democrats on 3%. Let's look at how the Welsh share of the vote compares with the general election of '87, with just one result here to come in mid-Wales. 4% up Labour, not anything like as much as Labour was up in the North Midlands and south of England, rather better than Scotland though. The Conservatives down 7%, so a swing there to Labour of 5.5%. You add them both together and divide by 2 and you get 5.5. Then Plaid Cymru doing pretty well in Wales, doing very well in Wales North, rather less well down here in the 2 southern seats. 10% up the Greens, well, of course, they weren't there before, so 10% is what they've actually got in Wales, and the others also up 10%. Now, Tony King, any judgments about Wales? I mean, Plaid Cymru clearly taking some of that Conservative vote, perhaps damaging Labour's chance of improving its position in Wales, but Wales is so safe for Labour already.
Well, you say so safe for Labour already. One of the things that was very striking about the 1983 election, when you'll remember that Mrs Thatcher really trounced the Labour Party, was that the Conservatives made very substantial gains in Wales indeed, including in Ynys Môn, which one can see up in the corner of the map there. And what's been happening is that has turned out, it appears to be rather of a fluke. And gradually Labour has been clawing its way back. Plaid Cymru, of course, and people in England often forget this, Plaid Cymru is not a Wales-wide party of any very effective sort. Its strength is very heavily concentrated in Welsh-speaking areas, with the curious result that although it gets a rather low proportion of the Welsh vote, it actually doesn't do too badly in terms of Welsh seats.
Tony, thank you. David?
Well, now, for a comment on the Welsh results, we go over to Nick Clark, who's been in North Wales. Nick?
Joe Wilson, congratulations on your victory. Was it, as many have said, that the Labour Party campaigned purely on domestic issues, or was there a European element in your campaign?
Of course there was a European element. We've campaigned on European policies. We believe that policies will solve our problems, and we have campaigned on those. We have campaigned on home issues as well.
The fact is that a lot of play was made of Mrs Thatcher's attitude to Europe and Conservative attitudes to various things ranging from the National Health Service to the poll tax.
Of course, because our government's attitude stops any benefit we might get from membership of the European community coming to us. So we had to campaign against the home government as well as campaigning for policies within the European community.
It looked at one stage as if the split opposition between you and Plaid Cymru might actually let the Conservative back in, didn't it?
Yeah, people who voted nationalist nearly let the Tories back in, yeah.
What do you say to that, David Ellis-Thomas?
Well, I don't agree with Joe. I think the Labour campaign was not fought on European issues. We fought on a Wales in Europe ticket, which was clearly committed to greater integration within Europe. What we've seen here is a swing from, at the UK level, from Tory to Labour. I wish Joe well, obviously, in his work in the Parliament, but I don't think that the electorate in North Wales were given the opportunity of debating the genuine European issues that confront us.
Well, Sir Anthony Mayor has joined us. From the Conservative point of view, this must be a bitter disappointment, this result.
It is a bitter disappointment, and particularly in view of all the hard work that Beata Brooks has done over the past 10 years and the way she fought during the campaign. And she, at the least, tried to keep the issues to European issues. She was just hideously let down by the Conservative Party nationally, who fought what must have been one of the worst campaigns of modern times, in which they seemed to invite people either to abstain or, if they did bother to vote, to go out and vote against Europe. And how any candidate can succeed in those circumstances, I don't understand.
What about Mrs Thatcher's own responsibility for that defeat?
Well, clearly she was the one who directed the campaign. It's no good blaming the poor party chairman. He merely carried out his orders. She is the one on whom the responsibility must rest.
Well, Joe Wilson, have Conservatives actually lost this campaign then, rather than you winning it?
We've won the campaign, all the others have lost it. We fought a hard campaign. I think it was a responsible campaign. We argued all the issues, whether they were issues at home or issues within the community. I think we did well and we deserved to win.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.
David Steele, you were noting what Sir Anthony Mayor said with some interest.
Well, I was trying to come on earlier when Cecil was defending the Tory campaign on the basis of the Tory manifesto. Now, I noticed that the Tory manifesto was not at all bad, but it contrasted very starkly with Mrs Thatcher's speech in Bruges and the actions of the government over things like the cigarette health warning and the language programme. And then latterly this very silly advertising campaign, which must have been directed with the thoughts of Mrs Thatcher in mind. Now, I think that that overlaid any success in the manifesto, which after all very few people actually read. And the fact is that most people thought, looking at the attitude that Mrs Thatcher's adopted to Europe, that when it came down to something like the cigarette packets, and Ted Heath was quite right to major on that, that's a very simple issue that people could quite easily understand. And if 11 member countries believe that in the single market in 1992 we should have a simple, stark health warning on the packets, for one member country to say, no, no, we must defend the British health warning, makes people think she's gone slightly off her trolley. And I do think that the whole character of the Tory campaign was lost from then on.
Do you think she's gone off her trolley?
No, she hasn't. But on this particular issue, she's wrong, and she has been wrong in her negative attitude to Bruges all the way through.
Joe Kaufman?
I think she's been off her trolley quite a while, actually. I think that when you've been in power for 10 years and you've filled your cabinet with unidentifiable non-entities so that they can't say a word against you, when your cabinet dislikes you as much as you despise it, then you really are in the Catherine the Great syndrome, and that's where we've got with the poor lady. I think that she has crossed a certain line from reality to some kind of transcendentalism, and this is one of the results of it. The other being the absolutely lunatic policies that this government is pursuing on the poll tax, on water privatisation, on all of these other issues, on the National Health Service, the fact that their main issue is inflation and they can't keep control of it, the fact that they have this enormous balance of trade deficit. These are all the things they've done wrong, and any Prime Minister might well have realised somewhere or other that she might bear a touch of the responsibility for it. Yet the other day when she was asked how they were doing, she said they were running neck and neck. Well, that's unreality if you like.
Mr Parkinson, despised by the Prime Minister and despising is what Mr Kaufman says of the cabinet of which you're a member.
I think when Gerald Kaufman gets onto the subject of the Prime Minister, the pleasant, reasonable person disappears and he becomes an objectionable squirt. I think that he should just reflect that a party led by Neil Kinnock has nothing to gain from getting into the business of slagging off leaders. I think we should conduct our politics at a rather better level than that. And so I just think that what he said was ludicrous and unnecessary. Now, as far as non-entities are concerned, could I just point out to him that in his shadow cabinet, the cabinet experience of the total shadow cabinet is about 6 months collectively. 2 of them were served in a cabinet for about 3 months each. John Smith, and I think there's one other, but I can't remember who. Oh, Hattersley. Hattersley was in a junior ministry for a time. The government is a strong government. I don't accept his description of it. Our policies have delivered this country from the mess that it was in. We will get on top of inflation. The right policies are being pursued, and I hope we can conduct the rest of the evening without attacking each other's leaders.
What about, while insults are being traded, what about what John Biffin said about you, Mr Parkinson, that he wanted you to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, thought this was a change that the Prime Minister should make. This is your old colleague, John Biffin, but that you risk being seen as the puppet of the Prime Minister if that happened.
Well, I'm flattered that John Biffin should mention me in that context, but I followed the
being a puppet, or
no, in the context of being the Chancellor. But like Geoffrey Howe, those things are not a matter for me. They're a matter for someone else. But and I don't accept that I would be a puppet any more than Mr. Kaufman is Mr. Kinnock's puppet.
I'm elected by the Parliamentary Labour Party.
On that note, let's have a look at some results, and a little calm will return to the studio while we do this. We've had now, in the United Kingdom as a whole, 61 results in. We've got another 6 to come tonight, I think. The Labour Party showing gains of 9, the Conservatives net losses of 9, and I think there have been, yes, I'm right, no losses at all from Labour and no gains from the Conservatives. So it is a straight swap of 9 seats that we're running at the moment, and let's just see some of the more recent results that have come in. London North West, and these are all London seats, so the interesting thing here is how Labour is doing in London, whether they're picking up in London as well as they've been in other parts of the country, because they've been very keen to make a showing here. Let's just see, this is Lord Bethell, incidentally, who was complaining about the campaign when I suspect he thought he'd lost. He's actually won with a majority of 7,000, almost identical to the majority he got at the last time round in London North West. And this is how the vote has changed. Conservatives are down on the general election by 11%, Labour up 9, the Greens up 16, and the Democrats down 14. And then London North, Mrs Thatcher now has, as a result of this Labour gain, a Labour MEP representing her in Finchley. And the Labour Party on 85,000, the Conservatives on 79,000, the Greens in third place in London North, the Democrats in fourth place. And the change, as a result, giving this majority of 5,800 on the election result of 87. Conservatives down 13, Greens up 14, Democrats down 13, Labour up 11. And London North East, Labour hold on to this. This has had a huge majority here in 84. They have a pretty huge majority now, not quite as big as some of those in the north, but a majority of 47,000, and a turnout rather low there, 28,000, 28%, one of the lowest turnouts we've had. And very similar pattern in the change of votes. And now London South East, a Conservative hold. Conservatives had nearly 50% of the vote in the last general election, and they've just squeaked in here with a majority of 7,000 against the 20,000 they had in this seat last time. Peter Price is in there. Again, Conservative vote down, Labour up 12, so Labour doing well in these London seats that we've had so far. Now, Ian Smith has been following the campaign in London West, and the count, and is down there now. Ian, it's yours.
Well, I'm joined now by Mike Elliott, the victorious Labour candidate, and the sitting MEP, and Brendan Donnelly, who's vanquished for the Conservatives. And I start with Mike Elliott. Do you see this as being a victory for domestic Labour policies now, or for policies that you were able to put forward as far as Europe was concerned?
I think it's partly both. Undoubtedly, there was a wave of public opposition to many of the present government policies. The poll tax, how unjust and unfair, treating everybody the same, whether they're rich or poor, and the great concern that people have about what's happened to our health service and the threat that saving money will be put before treating patients. There's also a lot of concern I found amongst elderly people who feel not enough's done for them.
But do you think these were crucial domestic issues, or were there European ones as well?
There are elements of European issues in them. Certainly the comparisons that we have been able to draw, I think effectively, between the way pensioners are treated in Britain and other European countries, where Britain comes out very poorly, particularly the blocking recently of the concessionary card and this sort of thing. But there are some specific European issues, and I'm thinking particularly of the course of 1992, and I think there was a public support for our ideas that the ordinary people of this country should be the main beneficiaries, not just the big companies.
Do you feel, though, Brendan Donnelly, that this represents a strategic change for the Labour Party, and you and the Conservative parties are now likely to suffer the same defeats in the future?
No, I can't see any reason at all to believe that. I don't think there has been a strategic change. Of the two factors that you've pointed to, I think the domestic questions were much the more important. Those are the ones that I got on the doorsteps. I don't think the European aspect of the campaign was of equal value with the domestic aspect.
So you don't think, as far as the Conservative Party is concerned, that these results are necessarily terminal?
By no means. On the contrary, I think they're very much in line with the sort of things that happened in 1981, 1985. Halfway through a parliamentary term, a sitting government is always vulnerable. I think it's entirely of a piece with that.
And I come over to Mike Elliott, the Labour Party very keen to make a good showing here in London. Yes. Do you think you've done it?
I think we have. London was not going to be an area of where we would make the biggest gains, because we did remarkably well last time in London. I wasn't supposed to have won 5 years ago, but I did. We have managed not only to hold on to what we gained then, but to make further advances. And I think that's very creditable indeed for us.
Very briefly, Brendan Donnelly, you only had to gain an extra 2.7%, yet you failed. Why?
The domestic reasons that I have already mentioned. There's no way in which the extra 9,000 votes, which have been gained this evening, could have been gained or lost on European issues. It was domestic issues that won and lost it.
Do you blame Mrs Thatcher?
All the Conservative Party has a message, which is that we must explain our policies even better. Prime Minister, me, everybody.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Back now to David in the studio.
Well, we've had a report of Mr Kinnock's movements today. He arrived at his South London headquarters around midnight with his wife and his daughter Rachel, and a spokesman said He was in an ebullient mood. He arrived in time to hear the Bristol and Leicester victories and the one very dear to his heart, Wales North. That made him burst into song in Welsh. And news for the Greens. The Greens, according to our latest figures, have held all their deposits so far, and the Democrats have so far lost 27 deposits in these elections, at which point we turn to Europe once more and have a look at how results are going there, because they're being continually counted. Peter.
And against this background of the British contribution to the European Parliament, completely reversing the position in 1984. There is Mr Kinnock forecast to have 45 seats, 13 more than he had before, 32 seats Mrs Thatcher, 13 fewer. And the Democrats with none, and the others with 4. There's the Highland Islands. We're still forecasting that will stay with Winnie Ewing. We can't be sure, of course, about that. Let's just have a look at the turnout in Europe. Here we have the turnout from Ireland so far beating the pack. The record is created by the Irish at the moment. Otherwise, the turnout is uniformly down in all the other countries. Spain 55%, Portugal 51%, France 50%, 47% in Denmark, Netherlands 47%. The British are the only country so far to have increased their turnout. We were 33% before, now 4% up on that, 37%. 4 more countries still to come, with Luxembourg down at the end there. Now, let's have a look at the way the governments in the European countries are coming out of this. The answer is very badly. On the whole, when you look at the share of the governing parties and their coalitions in these European elections, compared with the last general election, Mr. De Mita in Italy is down 5%. He's got a governing coalition with the Socialists. Of course, he's now a caretaker Prime Minister. Socialists, and with some of the Republicans in Italy, down 5% on the whole, the vote there for the parties of the right and centre in Italy. The UK, Mrs Thatcher, down 8%. In Germany, Chancellor Kohl is down a whole 10%, rather concealed in the swing to the swing that we had in Germany to the left. That was because, of course, the real problem in Germany is that the right, the far-right party, the Republicans, have gone way up, but Mr Kohl has gone down. That's the one that matters. That's the Free Democrats and the Christian Democrats in Germany, a 10% drop in their share of the vote. Let's look at some of the left-wing parties in Europe and their prime ministers. There's Felipe González in Spain, down 5%. Quite lucky not to go further down than that. Some thought he would go a lot further down. There's the Prime Minister of Greece, who lost his government in a general election today, 8% down. He's resigned. There's Andreas Papandreou gone. In France, we have a 15% drop for the Michel Rocard government there. The Socialists down by 15% in France. And the only governing figure not to lose any vote is Charlie Haughey in Dublin, the Prime Minister of Ireland, who has had no change, up or down, in his share of the vote. On the other hand, he did call a general election in order to get an increase in his parliamentary representation, so in a sense he has failed, because he's still got a minority of the seats in the Dáil. David.
Well, I'm going to pass to Stephen for a comment on the state of Europe generally, our Europe correspondent.
Well, as Peter Snow was pointing out, governments have done by and large badly, but I think one thing that hasn't been noted, most people expected the socialists to make gains all across Europe, not just in Britain. But in fact, socialists have made very, very few gains. In most countries they're down. And the parties that seem to be gaining are the protest parties, notably the Greens in this country, the Republicans in West Germany have got 8 or 9%, but also some very weird parties. There's a party in Luxembourg called the 5/6 Pension Group, campaigning for higher public service pensions. They've done very well. There's a party in Spain led by a man called José Mateos, who's wanted by the police for punching a minister. He's picked up 4% of the vote. So I think
that's a good protest vote.
Very distinct protest vote. So I think there is some justice in saying that in a European election in a lot of countries, people are voting for protest parties rather than on the left-right political spectrum.
Well, let's join Jeremy Paxman, who's in Brussels. Jeremy?
Hello, David. Yes.
How are things there? You have an interview for us, or somebody you've been speaking to?
Indeed, in just a second. Yeah, I think the feeling here is very much as Stephen was indicating, that the much predicted socialist swing hasn't really occurred. Predictions here are that the socialist group will go up from about 166 to something like 179, which is, in fact, I think, the number of increased Labour seats, isn't it, in Britain? Now, trying to make sense of this and of the Green vote, I spoke a short time ago to Leon Tindemans, of course, who's the well-known former Belgian foreign minister, who's stood for the European Parliament himself and is hoping to become president of the Parliament, and Paul Stace, who's leader of the Rainbow Alliance, which encompasses the Greens within the European Parliament. Here's what they had to say. Mr. Tindemans, it appears that the turnout in this election in most countries has been down on what it was last time. Do you think that indicates that people outside the UK, anyway, are increasingly disenchanted with the European Parliament?
No, I think that people don't see what is exactly going on in that European Parliament. They think that it has no competences. And indeed, we couldn't give it enough substantial competences until now, although the powers of the Parliament have been increased.
But it does seem to indicate that people have somehow lost a vision of what the Parliament could be about, haven't they?
Indeed, and if this continues, if we can't give substantial powers to that Parliament, next time it will still be worse. In '79 it was fantastic. People thought now we have a European Parliament, but we didn't find a real vocation for that Parliament. So we have to do it now, otherwise it will be lost.
Now, Paul Stace, the Greens have made gains, but you haven't made gains in those countries where you've been long established, like Germany or Holland. Now, what do you make of that?
Well, first of all, in Holland, they've doubled their votes when you look into the percentages. And on the other hand, in my own country, after the last information I've got, we are the biggest winners for percentages. On the other hand, it's the new sounds in politics maybe can attract quite a lot of people in anyway. On the other hand, I see as well that in those countries where Green politicians are in parliaments for some time, that they remain there, they are not losing. It's one of the democratical forces we have to make clear about in our democratical debate.
How are you going to press your position then within the European Parliament?
By going working as we have done the last 5 years. I think that's the main thing what we are for. On the other hand, I can understand completely the people that are not so very much interested in voting for the European Parliament, as long as those powers who can change the position, to give it more power, will go on asking them to vote on the one hand, and on the other hand refusing the conclusion of the vote.
But are all the people who voted Green really committed to the idea even of the European Parliament?
I think that might be one of a very clear point, that the people that have voted Green have a clear idea about Europe. It's not always the same idea.
Yeah, very often they just don't like it.
Maybe because in Great Britain they have to vote for a European Parliament where 14% of the votes going for the Green Party will not be represented on the democratical field. That's not the best point you can make, I suppose.
Now, Mr. Tindemans, looking at the broader question of what this Parliament's going to be about, from what we know of its composition, what would you expect its concentration to be upon?
Well, it must concentrate its efforts on the realization of the internal market. Still, 180, I think, directives have to be approved. And then these directives are not enough. We need also fiscal measures, social measures, and monetary measures. They are extremely important. They have not been decided. But experts say that if we want that market to work, we have to take other measures also, other than the 300 directives I just mentioned. And if all that is done, then we need a political structure that's clear. How can 12 men, 12 people, Council of Ministers, make the law, the directive for 320 million of inhabitants?
There's no question in your judgment then, but this Parliament is going to seek to take sovereignty to itself, to take ultimate power to itself.
It will be certainly the laboratory of all these measures which we need. If this Parliament is to be taken serious, it must prove that what we need can be done or can be prepared by this Parliament. Some are speaking of a constitution. This is maybe probably going too far, but it must prove now that it is necessary, that we can't work without a serious Parliament, and so we must do what is necessary to obtain powers for that Parliament.
Stephen Milligan, this is a most extraordinary election, isn't it, by any account? Everybody says that nobody knows what the European Parliament does, and everybody that one hears seems to say that people don't vote on the basis of it anyway. So here we all are, talking about the way Europe's going on entirely spurious evidence. It seems to be nothing to do with Europe at all.
Well, first of all, the European Parliament has actually acquired quite a lot more power in the last 2 years than it had before. It's often been dismissed as a mere talking shop, but since the Single European Act went through, it not only has the power to consider legislation, it can actually amend legislation and block it entirely. And we saw this most recently on the question of car exhausts. Against the wishes of most ministers, the Parliament voted for much tougher controls on car exhausts, and eventually the ministers were forced to accept it.
It hardly sounds a riveting turning point in the history of European politics.
I think it's highly important on an issue where green issues have been dominating the campaign. British car buyers are now going to have to pay £300 or £400 more for their car because of the pollution controls it's going to have to fit. So I think that is the kind of issue that will affect
Well,
people.
OK, if it's becoming so important, why is it that the turnout's down? I mean, Jacques Delors is saying a low turnout isn't a failure for Europe, but surely it is a failure. I mean, if now the Parliament is actually getting some teeth to it, people are backing off and not bothering to vote.
Well, I think the problem in most European countries is that all parties are in favour of Europe. There's not a real debate, and therefore there's not a real interest in the election. The one country where there was a real debate on European issues, curiously, was Britain. And in Britain, the turnout has gone up.
Tony King, do you agree with that as the reason for the turnout going up?
One of the things that strikes me about...
Not the turnouts going up, the turnout going up.
One of the things that strikes me about all these discussions is that we do a lot of breastbeating in this country about the fact that so few people turn out to vote in European elections. Well, one reason, I think, is to our credit. We don't get politically angry with one another to the extent that they do elsewhere on the continent. For example, in Northern Ireland, I'll just make one prediction. We haven't talked about Northern Ireland this evening. I'll bet you turnout in the European election in Northern Ireland was about twice as high as on this island that we're sitting on now, simply because people get more upset. But
what do you mean we don't get politically angry with each other?
Well, you might...
just seen Mr Corfin and Mr Parkinson being angry with each other. Maybe that was personal anger, not political anger.
It may well have been personal, and indeed some politicians do get angry with one another, but the proportion of the British people who really get upset about politics in the way that, for example, an Italian communist will get upset about politics, or now the German Republicans, is actually very small. But we also discourage people from voting in two other ways. One is that we do insist on voting on Thursdays, and if you actually look at turnout across the European countries, you find there's quite a strong relationship between whether people vote on a weekday or whether they vote on Sunday. Another thing we do, we were listening a moment ago to Jeremy Paxman talking to Leo Tindemans. He is one of the most famous Belgian politicians. He is actually a candidate for the European Parliament. You could take all of the candidates for the European Parliament in this country, march them down Oxford Street, march them around Manchester Piccadilly, and not a soul would recognise any of them. One of the oddest things about these elections is that none of the ardent Europeans whom we hear so much about and whom we hear so much from actually stand for the European Parliament. Except we do have one person in this studio who's a candidate for the European Parliament, but not in Britain at all, but in, I think, Italia Centrale. Very paradoxical outcome.
Right. Well, let's hear more from Germany now, particularly about what's happened to Chancellor Kohl. We've got an interview, among other things, with Chancellor Kohl and the latest news from Bonn, and for that we join Vivian White.
We have to compare this election with the European elections 5 years ago. In the meantime, an election for the federal parliament and a number of local elections have taken place. The forecast for us in the Union was worse than the actual result. This is no consolation for me, and indeed the result is not satisfactory. What is satisfactory is that we remain the largest party, and the fact that our coalition partner, the FDP, has again entered the European Parliament. What is totally unsatisfactory for us is the entry of the Republicans into the European Parliament. This development on the extreme right wing is something that we must follow with the greatest attention. We must make every effort in the next 12 to 14 months, until the German federal elections in December 1990, to win the voters back. I consider that possible, and we faced a similar situation back in the 60s with the NPD, a comparable party. Can you explain the success of the extreme right-wing Republicans to British viewers? And what should we in Britain think about it? I think that one should distinguish between the party and the electorate. The party and its leadership hold extreme right-wing convictions. There can be no doubt that the Republican Party is in no way suitable for forming a coalition. The electorate comprises many different elements. Farmers who are dissatisfied with developments in the EEC, they have to make sacrifices during a difficult transition period. There is dissatisfaction with social conditions. We need to take that seriously. There have been major developments in the field of immigration and the arrival of ethnic Germans from the Soviet Union and Poland.
ins Land kommenden Deutschen, etwa aus der Sowjetunion, aus Polen und aus...
Are they Nazis? The voters are certainly not Nazis. No, not the voters, but the party. No, that's putting it too simply. You could draw a comparison with France and Le Pen and other groups. You have to differentiate. However, we need to take the question seriously, and we are resolved to do that. The most important thing, if one is to make an accurate forecast for 1990, is not to overlook the turnout of voters. Now we have had something under 60%. For the federal parliament, the rate is around 90%.
Wir haben jetzt eine Wahlbeteiligung, die ich nicht genau kenne, unter 60%. Wir werden bei der Bundestagswahl eine Wahlbeteiligung in der Nähe von 90% haben.
After these results, sir, do you believe that you can remain federal chancellor? In this legislative period? Of course, I don't have any doubt at all.
Well, I did see the wind changing indeed. It was changing in our favor. We are back in the European Parliament. And there's a slight change in favor of the CDU, looking to the projections which we got before these elections. So there's no reason to talk and discuss future coalitions.
Are you afraid of the rise of the right-wing Republikaner?
Everybody is worried, and everybody has to be afraid. But I think we should give a few explanations, especially to British onlookers and the British audience. First, the European election obviously has not been taken as seriously as it should be. You look to the low turnout, by the way, in UK as well as in the Federal Republic. If you have a normal turnout at a federal election, between 80 and 90%, you will have a totally different picture and certainly totally different looking to the Republicans. Secondly, this is an election in which people think it is easy, it is not that important how you vote. So it's easy to express your dissatisfaction in housing, in asylum seekers, in economic circumstances, and so on, agriculture. All this has led to a result which I feel is more than worrying. It's embarrassing to all of us sitting around this table, but we should not overdo it, and certainly not overdo it in discussing it with our friends in Europe and on the other side of the Atlantic. We will fight these right-wingers, and we will fight them successfully. We have seen that in the past. I don't think that they will disappear, but we will keep them in limits which do not give any reason to be worried about the democratic position and democratic substance of this country.
That report from Bonn with Vivian White. Let's just have a look at some more results that have come in, and in particular look at the Green vote in these constituencies. And Peter in a moment will have some more on this. This is how the Greens are doing. Their share of the vote, 15%. They're second in 5 seats. And incidentally, they're third in a great many more, 45 third places. Conservatives hold on to the Cotswolds, and the Greens are second there, 49,000, just beating Labour into second place, majority of 45,000. And this is the change from 87 again. I think the question, though, will be what we're to make of these Green gains, which are seen everywhere, whether they really can be turned into anything. Let's see Sussex West in a general election. Of course, the Greens won't get any seats in the European Parliament on our system. Conservatives hold Sussex West, one of the older MEPs, Madron Seligman, and the Greens again in second place, Conservative majority 46,000. And there's the change. Conservatives go down. Greens a huge increase, 24% on their general election showing in Sussex West. The Democrats down 15%. Surrey West, another one with the Greens in second place. Labour on 28,000, Conservative majority there. The SDP stood there, they only got 3,500 or so. Again, the Greens up 22%, SDP just up 2%. And Devon, excluding Plymouth and David Owen and all that. Lord O'Hagan back, 110,000, again, Greens in second place. And we'll have a look at the change, huge increase for the Greens there, 22%. And the Democrats down 26% in an area where I should have thought the Democrats would have expected to do rather well. Dorset East and Hampshire West, you might have thought they could have got those constituencies sorted out, so it was Hampshire and Dorset, but they couldn't. Dorset East and Hampshire West, the Conservatives hold it, and again the Greens in second place. And another big increase for the Greens over the 87 result. Conservatives go down 8%, and the Greens are up 22%. Democrats down 21%. So, Peter.
Well, let's set Labour's victory in this European parliamentary election in the context of the last 10 years. The 6 major national elections in Mrs Thatcher's decade. Here's May 79, the general election which Mrs Thatcher won with a 7% lead over the Labour Party. There she's on 44%, 37% for Labour, the Liberals on 14%. Now you take Mrs Thatcher's Tories on through their successful elections in 79, the European election 79, the general election 83, and then the European election of 84, which again Mrs Thatcher's Conservatives narrowly won by 4% from the Labour Party on 37% there, and along comes the Alliance managing in that last European election 20%. So there's the divided opposition with Mrs Thatcher 4% ahead of the Labour Party there. Then the general election 87, of course, Mrs Thatcher convincingly won, but now see what's happened right at the end on this 6th national election. Down go the Tories to 34%, the Labour Party overtaking them on 41%. These are on the shares of the vote in so far. They may change by the end of the night. So a 7% Labour lead then, and look what's happened to the Democrats now, down there on 6%. That would be the lowest Conservative share of the vote in a national election this century. 36% was the score in the best so far, the worst so far, October 74. So there then you have just that broad picture there of the 6 elections under Mrs Thatcher, the 6 national elections under Mrs Thatcher, with Labour at last achieving what they've failed to do over 10 years, actually pipping the Conservatives really quite convincingly there by a 7% lead, and the Democrats collapsing down there. Now, again, a look at the votes in so far. Here they come, rolling in with Mr Kinnock over 5 million now, Mrs Thatcher there on 4 million. There they go, Sarah Parkin's Greens in 3rd place. There the Scottish National Party, 250,000, the Welsh National Party there on 115,000, there's Daffodillis Thomas, there's David Owen's SDP on 62,000 odd, and the others on 38,000. Share of the vote that represents 41%, Mr Kinnock, 34% as we've seen, Mrs Thatcher, 15% now, the Greens, 15%, 6% only the Democrats, and 2%, 1%, and Dr David Owen not even up to 1% yet. Now, all this, of course, means that there will be no European parliamentary seats because we don't have any proportional representation here for the Greens. No parliamentary seats in Europe for Paddy Ashdown. And let's see what would happen indeed if this were a general election. If this were a general election, you would have 341 Labour seats in a new parliament, 271 Conservative seats, just 7 Democrats and no Greens. And that is there's the 326 who need for victory, and the Labour majority there would be 32 if this were a general election. Now this is all happening with a share of the vote for Labour of 41%, the Conservatives 34%, the Democrats 6%, and the Greens 15%. So one immediately asks the question, what would happen, of course, if this were proportional representation? If that was so, then you would see the seats being distributed something more like in proportion to the share of the vote. With the Labour Party on 264, the Conservatives on 223, the Democrats, the share of the vote gives them a proportion of the seats, roughly 40 there, and the Greens with nearly 100 seats, 98 seats. And that would see no party with an overall majority. It would see no overall majority. It would see the Labour Party well short of the 326 you need. But amazingly, it would see the Greens with 98 seats in a parliament elected on proportional representation, if, of course, people voted this way in the general election. David.
Sarah Parkin, isn't that exactly the difficulty the Greens face, as Peter put it, that even the Democrats would have some seats in a general election on these results, and you, with that huge vote, 15% in your favour, would have none?
Well, I think it says something about our electoral system. There are 12 electoral systems in the 12 countries, but this is the only one that has not got some form of proportional representation. And in fact, this makes a bit of, we are mocked for this on the continent, because it does alter this, the different groups in the European Parliament and devalues the Parliament. And we feel very strongly about this, and we are planning to actually send the number of seats that we would have gained in the European elections. We will be sending those people to Strasbourg on the 25th of July to claim our seats. But we are rather more fortunate, perhaps, than the Democrats are, because we belong to the European Greens, which is a grouping of Greens from 15 countries beyond Europe, as not just the 12 of the EC, but in Finland, Sweden, and so on. And we have a common programme, and we also have a common agreement that whoever is elected to the European Parliament will represent all of us. So though we don't actually have the seats, we will be part of the decision making, we'll be part of the politics. And this is important because the European Parliament may not necessarily have a lot of power, but it is the only institution in Europe where there is open debate. And as more and more decisions are made about our future in Europe, it is crucial that that debate is used to talk about the issues. And we heard a bit here about how the European election has been fought by the other parties, and the Greens are the only one who've actually fought this election on the issues, 1992, the environment, and the relationship of Europe to the rest of the world.
Well, I think David Steele will have something to say about that in a moment, but he can't for the moment because you'll have to go over to Paris as you draw yourself up to speak. And we will, I promise, come back to you in just a moment because we have these windows through satellites to various parts. You wouldn't think you needed a satellite to Paris these days, but apparently you still need a satellite to get to Paris. When they've got the tunnel, we'll be able to just do it by a wire. But anyway, Edward Sturton, is in Paris. Edward, just tell us about the story in France at the moment.
Well, the latest predictions are still not final results, but they give a pretty clear idea of what's happened. They show a quite substantial lead for Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and his opposition list. He's expected to get around 29% of the vote, which is a very good showing for the former president of France, who at one stage in this campaign faced demands for him to step down in favour of younger men. Laurent Fabius, the former socialist prime minister, heading towards a disappointing 23%, and the Greens have slipped back a little from their good showing earlier in the evening, but are still holding to a substantial figure of around 10 or 11%. We've been seeking political reaction at the election night meetings of the main groups taking part in this battle for the European Parliament. A cheer from supporters of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing's opposition list. They achieved their stated objective of coming in ahead of the socialists, but it's by no means clear whether the result will stop the cries for a restructuring of the opposition and a power struggle on the right in the weeks to come.
We are divided in the opposition, and while we are divided, the results are not what we could hope to have. So the conclusion of that is that tomorrow we have to begin the rebuild of the opposition wider, and it is what we want to do very quickly.
Only half the electorate voted, and only about half of those who voted went for the two establishment lists. Simone Veil, leader of the centrist list, which scored respectably but not as well as she'd hoped, said on French television that that meant the voters were rejecting traditional parties. And the leader of the Greens, Antoine Vechter, reacted to early predictions of a 12% score by claiming his movement as the third force in French politics. Later figures put them behind the National Front, but they have secured their first seats in the European Parliament. At the Socialist Party, they tried to make the best of the bad news. Laurent Fabius's defeat is the first setback like this they've had since 1986.
Well, it's not as good result as I would have wished, but anyhow, it's quite a good result.
It's a bit less than the 25% that Laurent Fabius was hoping for.
Yes. He hoped for more, and so did we, and so did I.
Well, it could have been better, but I mean, it's about the same as it used to be before.
And a short while ago, the winner tonight, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, emerged to claim a comeback for the right in France. Well, I'm joined now by Yves Guillenec of Le Point magazine, a keen student of French politics. Yves, I think it's true to say that most people here are looking at the domestic implications of these elections. How important is Giscard d'Estaing's victory?
Rather important, I think. I think he's back in the saddle, and he will be able to claim that he now is the leader of the opposition, which is vitally important at the moment because there was a revolt brewing of the Young Turks. And I think he may, at least for a while, be able to silence that revolt.
Is he a potential presidential candidate next time round?
He may still deny it, but I think he probably still thinks about it, yes.
The socialists did very badly, or at least relatively badly.
Not too well.
Is this a judgment on Laurent Fabius and their European stance, or is it a judgment on the socialist government of France?
I don't think it's a judgment on the government. Probably the low score can be explained by the surge of the Greens, because the Green voters and the socialist voters tend to overlap. What it certainly shows is that the name of Fabius hasn't been enough to make the socialists pull through, and that, of course, might dim his hope for the future.
He'd hoped, of course, to use this campaign as a launching pad for his presidential ambitions.
Absolutely, yes.
Will this damage him very badly in that respect?
I think it probably will. I think the man who must rejoice tonight is his rival to the succession of the president, that is the Prime Minister.
You mentioned the Greens. To what extent is the Green vote a protest vote against the Socialists, and to what extent is it a genuine Green phenomenon?
I think it probably is a genuine phenomenon. I mean, you have the same in England, that's what I hear. You have had it, of course, for some time in Germany. I think it's here to stay.
Yves Guillenec, thank you very much. David?
Edward, just one thing. The Conservatives here look as though the change on the general election for them is 8% down, or perhaps 9% down. And they're sort of accepting that this is a judgment on Mrs Thatcher. I mean, even the Conservatives are saying, well, you know, we've got high interest rates and all the rest. Mitterrand seems to be 15% down, the Socialists, compared with the general election. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's correct. But
well, how can they say this is not relevant?
Well, what they're doing is pointing out that their vote is actually slightly up on the last European elections. So they are essentially trying to turn a defeat into victory by juggling with the figures.
But this is a rather thin consolation that even Mr Cecil Parkinson gave up very early on during this programme.
Well, the Socialists here are holding to it. And of course, Mr Mitterrand himself doesn't have to worry very much about it because his mandate runs till 1995. And there's no chance that this election is going to affect his fortunes.
Well, what's your view? What do you think it says?
I suspect that it reflects the fact that Valéry Giscard d'Estaing ran a very vigorous campaign. He was threatened from within his own supporters in the early part of the campaign, and he answered by showing that although he's an old warhorse, he can still come up with the goods. He travelled, I think, 25,000 kilometres in the course of the campaign, spent a large amount of money, and showed that he still had the vigour of a leader.
And so what's going to happen?
Well, the so-called renovateurs, the group of right-wingers who've been trying to get rid of the old leadership, hoped, although they didn't say so publicly, but hoped that Giscard d'Estaing would stumble this time. He didn't. They'll go on grumbling, but it'll be very difficult for them now to get rid of him.
Edward Sturton, thank you very much. Well, now, I said I would bring in David Steele, and I promised Mr Steele I will bring you in, but I'd like, just before I do, that we all have a look at how the Democrats have done, because I'm sure it'll help clarify the position for everybody and make your answers all the more pertinent and dazzling.
Well, this may seem unkind to David Steele, David, but remember the alliance? 26% of the vote in 1983, 23% of the vote in 1987. Just look how the promising are fallen. Here are the Democrats who inherited the mantle of the alliance. Look at the change in their vote from 1987. In Scotland, down 14%. And as you go down the country, so you see how the Democrats have collapsed. These are comparing the Democrats' votes this time with the performance of the alliance in 1987. Down 15% in Wales, in the Midlands, a whole collapse there of 16%, and in the South, down 18%. And when you move on to look at the Democrats' performance compared with where it did in the general election, this line here represents the general election performance of the alliance. This is the alliance performing in the general election. These little arrows here represent success if you go above the line, defeat if you go below the line, or doing worse than you were doing in the general election. Watch where the Democrat rosettes fall. First of all, the Vale of Glamorgan by-election, down 11%. They were scrapping away with the SDP there, down 11% on their performance in the general election. Now, the local elections, the Democrats thought was pretty good showing, but actually it was still 4% down on the general election share of the vote. In our poll of polls, which we published at the end of last week, they were still down 15% in that vital indicator of how people would vote in a general election, down 15% on how they were performing in the general election 2 years ago. In the Glasgow by-election, Glasgow Central by-election, they were 9% down. In the Vauxhall by-election, not so bad. They were there only 1% down. But now here, critically, in this big national election today, they are a whole 17% down on their showing in the general election. 17% down, that's just 6% share of the vote compared with 23% of the general election. Tony King.
Peter, some people think this is rather funny, some people think it's a great tragedy, but the fact is that here are a bunch of politicians who have shot themselves not just in the foot, but in every conceivable part of their anatomy. First you have the tremendous row over the merger, then you have the David Owen breakaway and the formation of effectively a new political party. Then you have the row over the dead parrot policy document. Then you have this curious business of the name. The Democrats have an identity crisis. They don't seem to know who they are. They have different different names in different parts of the country. The electorate certainly doesn't know who they are particularly. And finally, I think we now have to accept that they probably made a mistake in changing the leadership. I would guess now that most Democrats desperately wish that David Steele were still their leader rather than Paddy Ashdown. For all those reasons, that credibility that they built up so successfully during most of the 1980s, they have now completely destroyed.
Back to you, David.
Well, Mr. Steele, do you think most Democrats would rather have you than Paddy Ashdown?
No, I think Tony King is being delightfully mischievous at this late hour in the broadcast.
He's not normally mischievous. He normally gives it straight from the shoulder.
On the contrary, he's quite frequently mischievous. I've known him far too long. And he's certainly being mischievous now. But the others have had mischief thrown at them, so why should I object to it thrown at me? I don't think that is true. And I was consoling myself, or rather trying to transfer thoughts to Paddy to console him, that I well remember a period in my leadership when we were running fourth in elections to the National Front. And I think if you're going to run fourth to anybody, I would prefer to run fourth to the Greens than to the National Front. So these things come and go. I wouldn't, I'm not pretending this is a happy night. It isn't. But I don't want to repeat what I've said twice already about the reasons why I think this may be different from local elections and general elections. But I had some other things I want to say, if I may.
Just before, can I stick with you and the party?
Sure.
Not on the question of the leadership, but do you think now that perhaps it was a mistake to move as fast as you did in the light of these results? I mean, you've been asked this question consecutively, and you will continue to be asked it, whether it was a mistake to force the hand of the two parties into merger so quickly after the general election.
On the contrary, if there was a mistake on my part, it was leaving it so long. But I mean, that's a matter we can discuss on some other occasion.
What, not doing it before that election?
Indeed. But and I think history may show that that was true. But
everyone one talks to in your party now puts the blame, and they were on Thursday night here, on the ructions with David Owen and that decision, and they say that's why you're not doing well.
I think if
he'd been handled differently, maybe it would have been possible to keep him in the club.
Possibly so. I don't know. I challenge anyone to handle him differently. I mean, I think it's very, very difficult.
You mean you don't trust anyone to handle him well? You mean, or you don't know how you don't know how he ought to be handled?
I worked very effectively with him for whatever it was for 4 years, but I think there came a point where he was never actually going to come round to accepting the logic of forming one effective movement, and we were always going to have the difficulties we had in the last election. That's why I say that it should have been done earlier. And in fact, I drew back from it in '83. I wanted to do it then, but felt that because he was the new leader of the SDP and didn't want it, that it should not be pressed then. I think possibly if you ask me had I made a mistake, that was the mistake. We should have pressed it at that time. But anyway, that's interesting by history. What I would like to say is that on the issue which Sarah raised about proportional representation, I think it's very important that she doesn't just take her numbers to Strasbourg, as we did, in fact, on a previous occasion. But we must remember that the Treaty of Rome actually calls for a common election system, and it's actually very nearly a scandal that we've done nothing about it. And I hope that her fellow troops in other countries, as ours, will actually raise this issue much more effectively in this Parliament than we have in the last two, because there's no doubt they should be represented, we should be represented. We just saw a few moments ago Lambsdorff, the leader of the German Liberals, coming back in, fortunately, which is some cheer for us tonight, our allies in Germany, with their 5 or 6%, which is actually less than we have, but we have no representation, and they have, and they have an effective system. I would like to say more about what Tony King said earlier about the style of campaigning in other countries. There's no doubt from my experience in Italy that the whole process of electioneering for Europe was at a much higher level than it was in this country.
I read you were complaining that you couldn't knock on doors, and it was all done in a way that bemused you, apart from not speaking Italian,
what
which
I meant
made it very easy.
The meetings were larger. The whole thing had a vibrancy about it, which the Euro election campaign didn't have here. And I found that very interesting. The fact that the Italians are having a referendum on actually handing over more power to the European Parliament, something that no other country is having.
But that's because they've got such chaotic government. They'd be delighted for
I do want to nail this. This idea there's a government crisis.
Well, there is a government crisis.
Well, that's what it's called, but it's actually just a government reshuffle. It's no more of a crisis, less of a crisis than we've got in this country.
The government falls about every year, every 11 months, I think, on average.
The difference is that the cabinet reshuffle in Italy includes the Prime Minister, an idea which might well appeal to Messrs Howe and Lawson at the present time. That's the only difference. Other than that, Italy has great political stability.
So
They've caught up with us economically.
You fought your most vibrant campaign ever in Italy Central?
No, I wouldn't say it was the most vibrant campaign ever, not at all. But I enjoyed the experience of taking part in somebody else's campaign. And I do think, quite seriously, that apart from the serious political points that were being made in that campaign, I think this is the way of Europe for the future, that if you're going to have a multinational democracy, then those who have fellow feelings, fellow political ideas across national boundaries must get together. And we have done that with our election manifestos, but it's the first time we've done it by transferring candidates.
John Cole.
If I just make one last point, I do wish that more British politicians, like Ted Heath, for example, who was admitting the other day he'd contemplated standing in the first Euro Parliament election after he resigned as leader or left as leader. And I wish he did, because there you've got Giscard d'Estaing in France, you've had Brandt in Germany, you've got Tindemans in Belgium, all these well-known names, and in Britain we haven't.
John Cole.
I wonder, could I make a mischievous point while David's being mischievous? Yes, this mischievous point about proportional representation.
Oh, I know you've always been against it,
I don't
John.
know, well, let's leave out whether I'm against it or not, but look at Peter Snow's figures that he gave us a short time ago of the projection to the UK Parliament of these results tonight. Now, I don't know whether we can get the figures up, but if we...
He's fighting hard.
He's fighting hard to get them.
Of course we can, John. Of course we can. Now, here are the seats under the present system. There's the majority. There's the Labour majority of 18. That's under the present system and based on the shares of the vote in this European election. Here's what the shares of the vote were in the election: 41% Labour, 34%. There are the Democrats, there are the Greens, and this is the number of seats they would have under proportional representation.
Westminster Parliament, we're talking.
Absolutely, Westminster Parliament.
Now, thank you very much, Peter. Now, the point there is the only coalition governments that I can see available in that, if you rule out a grand coalition between Labour and Conservative...
Let's just see the figures on the screen while you're talking about it, John, because it'll make it clearer, that's right.
Yes, right. If you rule out a grand coalition between Labour and Conservative, which from the views of Mr Kaufman and Mr Parkinson tonight, I would have thought wouldn't be a very happy alliance, the only other one that's available, because the Democrats have done badly tonight, they, united with either Conservatives or Labour, would not in fact give a majority in the Parliament. So it's got to be a Green and Labour or a Green and Conservative coalition. I don't think the Conservatives would be very happy to have a coalition on unilateral nuclear disarmament as part of the platform. Labour is held to have done better tonight for one reason, because it has detached itself from unilateral nuclear disarmament. Would it go back to it in order to attract Green partners? I don't think we've got a government there.
It's force majeure, isn't it? Not happiness that counts.
Well, but would it go back there immediately after having abandoned it? Could it credibly govern after doing that?
But hang on, John, you're piling hypothesis on hypothesis then.
Well, it's hypothesis we're doing.
I know. I mean, I love Peter's graphs and so on, but we all know that are fair story. I remember he predicted I was going to have a government majority of 240 after.
Well, maybe you were going to at one point.
No, I wasn't.
Before you crashed.
I know, but I never was, and nor are these figures going to come out either. So
they are national figures.
Tony King.
No, I know, but
I just think in all these discussions, one thing one does have to bear in mind is that people vote differently under PR. Peter Snow mentioned this at the very end of his original introduction of those graphs. The Liberals can quite reasonably claim, I think, or could in the 50s and 60s, that more people would have voted for them under PR than did under the existing electoral system. It's also perfectly possible, though Sarah Parkin won't thank me for saying this, that if people actually knew more about the Greens and thought they might actually be electing Green MPs, they might think twice about it.
Stephen Milligan, very briefly.
Well, there's been a lot of speculation in West Germany that there would be a red-green coalition. What's rather interesting on tonight's results, if proportional representation was reflected in a German national election, the party that would be holding the balance of power in Germany would be the far-right Republican Party, which some might say was an argument against proportional representation.
Both of you from the two major parties are against proportional representation, are you?
Yes.
Gerald Kaufman?
We've just heard very good reasons why it's unsatisfactory. Do we really want a situation in West Germany which could happen, in which those far-right people went into a coalition in order to enable Chancellor Kohl, who would hate to have them, remain Chancellor Kohl? That's one example. Another we've had put forward here. You've got a system in which the parties that get most votes are manipulated by the parties who get least votes to abandon their own policies. I don't regard that as satisfactory. You can look all over the world. You can look at the terrible situation in the state of Israel as a result of their proportional representation system. I prefer to stick with the system we have.
Cecil Parkinson, you're in agreement with Mr.
Yes, I am. People
I
try to pretend that proportional representation is a way of making sure that extremists never get power. But as everyone knows, Hitler came to power in Germany under a system of proportional representation with 35% of the vote, and Allende came to power in Chile with exactly the same proportion of the vote.
Compare those two, please.
Well, they're both extreme governments. And as you pointed out yourself tonight, had we had proportional representation, it could have been the far right in Germany holding the balance of power.
But there are, first of all, there are different systems of PR, and Gerald knows perfectly well we've never advocated the system they have in Israel for the reasons he's rightly put forward. The other thing is that when you talk about the far right in Germany, all that has happened by my reading, and I wonder if Stephen Milligan would comment on this, is that the far right that used to exist within the government coalition in the shape of Franz Joseph Strauss in Bavaria has now expressed itself as a separate movement in a more extreme and nasty form, but nevertheless that was contained within the CDU-CSU coalition in Germany, and therefore there's really no difference in the political picture.
Well, it's certainly true. The results show that they've scored very highly in Bavaria, which is Joseph Strauss's territory. I think they've got 15 or 16% there. They are taking on policies which are more to the right than the CSU had, particularly on immigration, which has become really the hot domestic issue in Germany. I think they've had 300,000 people who've come in the last year, mainly from Eastern Europe. But they are adopting policies well to the right of what Mr. Strauss adopted.
Sure, but I think the point I'm making is that while he was there, he did tend to contain the far right within his whole sort of persona and within his identification in the CDU government.
We turn now back to British politics for a moment. Now, first of all, we've got our first recount of the night going on. Mr. Prout in Shropshire and Stafford, the Conservative, is having a recount, and I assume, unless as it could be a recount about not losing a deposit, it may be that Labour and Conservative are very close in Shropshire and Stafford, but we shall hear about that in a moment. In the meantime, we've had 65 results in so far. Let's just have a look at how the parties have fared. 65 results in. Labour is now 10 seats up at 39, and the Conservatives 10 down at 26. There's been no change in the other seats. And here are some of the seats that have come in since we last looked at them. A Labour hold in Derbyshire. This was thought to be a Labour weak spot. It's the sixth most marginal seat on a UK basis in Britain. When I say on a UK basis, I mean not for the parties, but just an overall sixth most marginal seat. But the Labour majority, as it turns out, of 33,000, well up on their 84 result. Conservatives in second place. And this is what's happened to the share of the vote since the 1987 general election. Again, the Democrats down, same story. Hereford and Worcestershire, James Scott Hopkins in the safe Conservative seat is safely in, and the majority is just a bit down from last time round, well, quite a bit down from last time round. And the change on the general election, 10% and 10%, the Greens at 23% up, the Democrats 23% down. There's symmetry for you. Hertfordshire, Cecil Parkinson's area. He's saying good, this safe Conservative seat. They're all Conservative MPs, and the Conservative majority of 43,000 turnout rather low at 36%, or perhaps that's on average. I think that's the average turnout at the moment anyway. Greens up 20, the Democrats down 20. And now York. The Conservatives have held on to York, and the majority there 15,000, and here's the change. There's Conservatives, Labour, Green and Democrats, so Greens again in third place in York. And Northumbria, Labour's held on to this. It had a smallish majority last time, up in the general election and up again to 60,000 this time. The Northumbrian vote for Labour rising 15% since the general election in 87. The Conservatives going down 5, the Greens up 13, the Democrats down 23. Essex North East, one the Conservatives should hold and did, and their share of the vote fell rather similar to the way it's fallen in the rest of the country. That's to say, when we see the share of this majority, 39,000, the Conservatives have gone down 11%, Labour up 11%, the Greens up 22%, and the Democrats down 22%, and that is another example of perfect symmetry between the two major parties and the two minor parties. London South West, which was a Labour gain, Dame Sheila Roberts is out, and Anita Pollock in, Very close result this, a majority of only 518 to Labour in London South West. And the change, Labour gone up 10%, the Conservatives down 13 and a bit percent, the Greens have taken a lot, 18.3%, that may have allowed Labour in, and the Democrats down 14.8%. So a big swing to the Greens there in London South West, and it allows Labour to take the seat. So those are a few results, and we've got now 2 to come, and if we get any news about the recount in Shropshire and Stafford, I'll bring it to you straight away. People who live in that constituency will be keen to know what's happened. Peter.
So what are the dimensions then of this Conservative defeat? Here is the share of the vote in this European election so far. 40% Labour. The Conservatives on 35%. If they stay that way, it'll be their lowest share of the vote in the national election this century. The Democrats on 6%. And the others there, including the Greens, on 19%. Here's the Conservative drop in the vote, region by region, starting with Scotland. And here we have the share of the vote as compared with 1987, the general election of 87. For the North, down 3% in Scotland, down 7% in the North. It's really in these regions like the North and the Midlands and the South that it really matters, because that's where the Conservatives have these precious marginal seats for Labour to pick up. There's the Midlands, down 11%, and in the South, the Conservatives are down a whole 10%. Those are the key places, the Midlands and the South. The North is also very important. Labour not doing quite so well there, but here is where Labour are doing well. That's pushing the Tory vote down, and that's where it's really hurting. Now let's go to the House of Commons and look inside it and look at, see what sort of shape the House of Commons would take if this had been a general election, which of course it wasn't. But let's see what would happen, just to illustrate it, to see what would happen if it was. There's the Speaker's chair on the opposition benches. There's Mrs Thatcher. There's the opposition building up there, a total of 316 in the opposition. There's the magic winning post you need, the 326 you need for an overall majority. And here now comes the Labour Party, and it's through the winning post, fairly convincingly, but not with much more than a working majority. Let's see how much the majority will be. Just 18. Well, now, Tony King, what do you think is the dimension of this Conservative defeat?
It's very often said, and it's been said in the studio, that governments lose elections, oppositions don't win them. But the fact is that for a government to lose an election, there has to be an opposition party that people are prepared to vote for. And it seems to me the significance of tonight is twofold. First, it shows that the Conservative vote is spongy. We've known that for quite a long time. The opinion polls, for example, often ask people whether they feel very close, fairly close, or whatever to one or other political party. And a quite small proportion of Conservatives feel very close to their party. So the Conservative vote is liable to flake off. Now, the key question is to where. And there's been no answer to that question for many, many years now. Increasingly, it does look as though there is a single opposition party to which people can turn if they want to get out the government and if they feel confident in that party. It seems to me that the significance of tonight, and indeed of the events of the last few months, lies very largely in the realignment of the opposition rather than in what's happening to the Conservative Party. Because as Sir Geoffrey Howe said much earlier in the programme, in a sense this is a big mid-term by-election, and by the standards of previous mid-term slumps, as Conservatives keep saying absolutely accurately, the Tories aren't doing all that badly.
Thank you, Tony. David?
Well, we were talking about earlier on in the programme the nature of the Conservative campaign, and I was referring to various grumbles there have been. We're joined from Westminster by a Tory MEP, Peter Price, who actually won his seat in London South East, but nevertheless has been very critical of the way the campaign was conducted. Mr. Parkinson is sitting on my right here and will listen with interest to what you have to say, Mr. Price. What's your objection?
Well, I think the campaign has been a complete irrelevance because the people who are actually going to be elected and take the decisions have played virtually no part in it. Both the major party leaders decided to exclude the members of their own party in the European Parliament from the campaign. In the Conservative Party case, we had, as it were, a back seat in the campaign. On the Labour side, they were excluded totally. And that was, of course, because the Conservatives were clearly much more positive than the Prime Minister wanted to be at this time. And on the Labour side, you had the Labour MEPs in the grip of an anti-Kinnock, anti-European majority, and they weren't going to be left anywhere near a television camera or a pressman during this campaign.
What was the impression that the Prime Minister left on the electorate, in your view?
I think a wholly negative one. And that, of course, started long before the campaign itself. This started back last summer with comments about things in the community going on over her dead body, then the Bruges speech, which appeared to call into question the Single European Act, which we'd ratified. Then we ran into the campaign itself, and the people in central office and those who were designing the advertisements carried on that negative theme with the personal approval of the Prime Minister. And that negative theme was, I think, one of the reasons why our party has done, apparently, so badly in these elections. And that's something which we Conservative MEPs would not have done if we had been in charge of our own campaign.
Cecil Parkinson, you've heard the charge about the negative campaign from the horse's mouth, a candidate who was there fighting a campaign and wanted it fought differently. What do you say to his charges?
Well, first of all, it isn't true that the European MEPs were ignored. I did a press conference with Christopher Prout. Christopher Prout, the leader of the group, played quite a major part, a key part in the campaign, was very much in the inner circle which was directing the campaign. Of course, you can't have every member in that group, but their leader was, and he played a role in the campaign. Secondly, I don't think that the campaign was a negative one at all. What we were saying were the very positive contributions we've made to Europe, the restructuring of the budget, the way we have led the way in reforming the CAP, the very constructive things we've been doing in Europe were stressed. The very negative aspects of some of the proposals that were being made by the other parties was also put over. So I don't think it was a negative campaign at all.